You don't exist. Take a perk and a talk of that shit. Money swallowed like sis. Dead up perfect in the kid. Got a billion who sang on my head. Look up better put on the road I just spent. I know we got $1 million. The devil that shit ain't not cheaper again.
Hello and welcome back, fellow anime lovers, to MangaMuse. I am delighted to have you join us once again in the world of fanfiction and fantasy. This is the 9th part of What If Deku Enters Gravity Falls. Special note, this fanfic is written in a masterpiece of jkawsome on FANFICTIONnet. Do check and support the author too. Now smash the like, share and subscribe button for more. Also press the bell icon so that you never miss such great parts. Thanks for the introduction. Now let's dive into the world. It makes a certain amount of sense, Izuku admitted quietly, as the four of them huddled together. Cypher always seemed to know everything, right? I mean, he couldn't get inside people's heads without permission, but he knew things, most of which he couldn't have been there for. I guess that's where the weirdness knowledge is coming from. But why now? Shoutout had Cypher's powers for months at this point. Why would he only now start gaining more of Cypher's abilities, or seeing his memories, for that matter? Things started feeling strange after Weirdmageddon, Shoutout said softly. It was just small things at first, so I didn't really think too much about it. His knees were tucked in, his arms hugging them, and despite their best efforts, he was still staring off into space. Maybe it was some sort of, I don't know, fail-safe, Ochako suggested, her voice wavering. For if he died, Mina shuddered. Do you think that's why Shoutout got those chaos flames in the first place? Because Cypher anticipated this? Shoutout shook his head. I don't think so. When Ford and I first encountered him during Weirdmageddon, he seemed surprised that I had them. Or maybe he was just surprised that I could actually use them well enough to temporarily unfreeze Ford. Or he didn't think I'd actually try to use them against him. I don't know. He pulled his legs in closer. Cypher, he kept calling me his puppet. Because of the puppet show, I thought, but what if? Mina almost died because of me last time. If it happens again. It wasn't your fault, Mina practically snapped. We already told you, you can't blame yourself for that. And you can't blame yourself for this either. There was a long moment of silence, and Izuku swallowed. Cypher was supposed to be gone. He wasn't supposed to be able to hurt them anymore. He certainly wasn't supposed to be affecting Izuku's friend like this. We need to talk to Ford, Izuku finally said. If anyone knows how to fix this, it's him. But how? Mina threw her hands up in the air. There still isn't a portal we can go through, which means they haven't figured things out on the other side yet. Maybe the loci could help, Ochako suggested. Can it even reach us here? It had to know something in order to bring us over the first time. Maybe? They all waited while Mina concentrated for a moment. Then she groaned and hung her head dejectedly. No use. If there is a way to contact it, it won't be the same way we could in Gravity Falls. Izuku hummed. It did manage to open Kurogiri's portal, though. Maybe it's able to use a portal quirk to make portals between worlds. So, theoretically, if we managed to get Kurogiri to open a portal, could we contact the loci through that? He frowned. But he's in Tartarus now anyways, and he would never help heroes in training like us. Especially if he had nothing to gain for it. They all thought on this for a moment. Kurogiri wouldn't, Shoutout started hesitantly. But Shirakumo might. Ochako turned to him curiously. Shirakumo? Shoutout shrugged. It was one of the things I saw. Another weirdness knowledge moment, I guess. But it's like with All for One, there's a sort of certainty there, and I'm sure it's the case. And? Mina prompted. Shoutout took a deep breath. Kurogiri, I think I know he's like Mamu. He was experimented on and turned into Kurogiri. That's not who he originally is. His actual name is Shirakumo, and I think Shirakumo is the kind of person who would help us. And considering everything that had been going on, Izuku had no reason to doubt that. So if we could make Kurogiri remember being Shirakumo, or somehow reverse whatever process made Shirakumo into something like Namu, then maybe we could actually contact the loci and Gravity Falls. Plus, if he wasn't originally a villain, then we should at least try and save him from being forced into being a villain, right? But we'd need to know we could help Shirakumo before we attempted anything like that. He trailed off, then looked at Shoutout. Like using magic chaos flames that can do just about anything. Plus, if all this cipher stuff was connected to using your flames, it probably wouldn't be getting worse because you haven't used them that much lately, so it should be fine. Shadow met his gaze, then looked down at his hands wearily. It's still a risk. While my flames do what I want most of the time now, it's not 100%. Waiting around while things get worse is also a risk, Mina said gently. We still need to figure out how to get to Kurogiri to do all this in the first place, Ochako pointed out. He's currently in a max security prison. If we just went up to the guards and said, hey, we need to release a villain so we can undo some human experimentation and open a portal to another world, they'd never believe us. There's no way they'd help. Or worse, they would believe us, Mina pointed out. And then suddenly the government knows about other worlds and our supernatural powers, and we all know how well that went back in Gravity Falls. I don't know about you guys, but I don't want to have to escape before getting locked up in a government facility again. We're trying to undo some experiments, not get experimented on ourselves. So then, what options do we have? Break Kurogiri out ourselves. There was another pause. I mean, this wouldn't be our first prison break-in, Shoto pointed out. Sure, but last time it was a small prison in a small town, not a max security prison, Ochako reminded him. If we want to do this, we'll need to be a lot more careful. It would be in our best interest to make it look like Kurogiri broke himself out, Izuku mused, considering the idea. Then once he remembers being Shirakumo again, we can say we found him like that. Either that or, if need be, we can say that we found him as Kurogiri and helped him remember. And I did bring a lot of the tech Magucket, and I worked on back during our last prison break, which would definitely be useful because no one here has dealt with how creatively Magucket makes his things before. Mina nodded along. That sounds good. How long do you think it would take for everything to be upgraded to breaking into Tartarus level? And we'll still need to come up with a solid plan. About a week, I think. Maybe a bit more, Izuku admitted. Just to be sure. And if Ford manages to get a hold of us before then, we can just switch plans. I mean, I still think that if Shirakumo was forced into villainy, then we shouldn't leave him like this, but we might not need to break in either. We'll keep things low-key until then, Ochako agreed. She reached over and squeezed Shoto's hand. We'll fix this. We promise. I know, Shoto said softly. We will. Mina smiled. And we can definitely do low-key for the next week. I mean, how hard could it be? Shoto was pretty sure his 4 problem children were going to be the death of him. They had, finally, returned to the USJ so that the students could actually have their rescue class. 13 was well enough to join them and had insisted on it. All Might was actually on time, which made a nice change. And while most of the students seemed to be nervous at first, they were also eager to finally learn the lesson that the villains had interrupted. And then there were the world travelers. He'd been aware that they'd been visiting the USJ for quirk training purposes since returning, so it wasn't that much of a surprise when they were less initially cautious than the rest of the class. No, the problem started afterwards, when they'd actually gotten to working on rescue training. For Midoriya, Uraraka, and Ashido, 13 had placed them in the ruins zone. Midoriya's volatile quirk didn't only break his bones, but had also caused massive amounts of damage each time he used it. Being in a zone with lots of buildings sensitive to collapse would force him to think more creatively. Ashido was placed there for similar reasons, with how potentially destructive her acid could be around unstable structures. Uraraka's zero gravity would be useful, but like the others, she would need to learn how to use it carefully. For Todoroki, Shouta insisted he go to the conflagration zone. It would be important for him to learn how to work in an environment where his ice wouldn't be nearly as effective. While Shouta had noticed that Todoroki wasn't using his fire at all for the first few days, besides to melt his ice, he'd used it occasionally since, which meant it was less of an issue and more of a choice to favor one side over the other. He still used his ice far more often though, and Shouta hoped to push him out of his comfort zone. First there was Midoriya. As soon as their group's lecture was over, and the objective to secure a civilian, in this case a doll with a tracker in it without creating more damage to the doll or the surrounding structures, was announced, Midoriya started glowing with green sparks and shot off like lightning. Midoriya's civilian was secured within minutes, with no damage to the doll or his surroundings, and he was the first one back. Arriving back at the starting point, Midoriya beamed at Shouta's raised eyebrow. I learned how to use my quirk without breaking my bones, sensei. Clearly, Shouta agreed, a little impressed but unwilling to show it. Good job. When did that happen? He very clearly remembered that quirks didn't work in that other world, after all. Oh, it was 2 days ago. Turns out I was just thinking about my quirk all wrong. 2 days with this much progress. Maybe Shouta was more than a little impressed. That was a lot of progress in a very short amount of time. Although he still wasn't sure how thinking about one's quirk wrong conflated to break all the bones in one's body. He was about to ask, but then Ashido and Uraraka emerged from nearby buildings, Uraraka on the ground floor and Ashido on the roof. Got it. Ashido held up her doll triumphantly, then jumped right off the roof. Shouta was rushing forward immediately except before he got there. A light blue glow surrounded Ashido, and she landed gently on the ground, high-fiving Uraraka, whose hands were lit up with that same glow. A glow that was not a part of Uraraka's quirk. Deal with that afterwards. Trying to calm his own heart rate, Shouta turned to Ashido instead. What, exactly, was that supposed to be just there? Ashido blinked. You mean jumping off that building? I knew a Chaco would catch me. And if she wasn't there? If she was too slow to react? Shouta pointed out. In this scenario, you also have a civilian that you're trying to protect. This isn't the time for risky maneuvers. It wasn't risky, Ashido protested. I only jumped because I knew she could catch me. We've done it plenty of times before, from much higher places. Despite clearly intending her towards to be reassuring, this did not reassure him in the slightest. If I thought she couldn't do it for some reason, I wouldn't risk it. I'd just grapple down instead. And she pulled out a grappling hook, for emphasis. There wasn't any risk involved, I promise, Uraraka agreed. I knew what she was doing, and I knew I could catch her. Shouta raised an eyebrow. You planned this out beforehand? Well, no, but we've done it enough times that I know when my friends are relying on me to catch them. Fantastic. Shouta pinched the bridge of his nose. The two girls clearly weren't lying, but that just opened up a bunch more questions. It meant that during the months they were gone, the students had developed the sort of reflexive trust that usually only pro-hero teams had. It also meant that they'd been in enough situations where they'd needed to develop that trust, or they'd just thrown themselves off of things for fun. Shouta wasn't sure which one he'd prefer. He turned back to Uraraka. That wasn't your quirk, that you just used. Uraraka smiled back at him. It wasn't. Shouta stared at her. Uraraka just kept smiling back. Shouldn't we get back to the exercise, sensei? We will talk about this later. Quirk or not, as her homeroom teacher, Shouta needed to know about developments like these. Thankfully, the rest of their exercise proceeded fairly normally, until Ashido lifted up a life-size busted car. And then there was Todoroki, who, Shouta noted as everyone had gathered back in the central plaza at the end of the class, tired but happy, had smudges of concealer that must have come off in the conflagration zone, the yellowing of bruises underneath. Shouta intended to pull him to the side after class, but didn't get the chance. Todoroki had slipped away as soon as everything was over, along with the other three. That didn't mean Shouta had forgotten, however, and he was certainly going to keep an eye on it. Tenya was worried for his friends. Of course, he knew they could take care of themselves, even when some of their classmates had quietly, or in Bakugou's case, loudly wondered why those 4 specifically had been taken. Tenya was sure they would be all right. Midoriya and Uraraka were strong and crafty. Todoroki had already shown his skill, and while he hadn't known Ashido at the time, he was sure she would be safe with the other 3. Then they'd been rescued, and any doubts the rest of the class might have had about their capabilities went right out the window the moment Midoriya dodged Bakugou's explosions, and Uraraka shrunk Bakugou down to miniature and put him in the jar. They'd used the jar twice again since then, once more for Bakugou, and another time for Mainta, who had attempted to spy on the girls while they were changing, and therefore was sentenced to being placed on a high shelf away from everyone else for their next class. The timeout jar was a very useful thing. Then there was how they performed in Foundational Heroics class, all 4 suddenly excelling every afternoon. Tenya was delighted to see that Midoriya had figured out how to use his quirk without injuring himself, But the others had also improved by leaps and bounds, to the point where Tenya wasn't sure how he was going to catch up. And, of course, there was how skilled they all seemed to be at hand-to-hand combat, despite only training for a few months. Tenya certainly hadn't realized how skilled they were during the team battle exercise, but they were clearly advanced, Uraraka and Todoroki especially. Of course, a part of him wondered how they all seemed to have the same teacher for multiple months when they'd only met about a week ago. Combining that with Uraraka's hair change, and Tenya had started to wonder just how long they'd been in the apparently very strange state of Oregon. But he'd decided not to ask. Whatever had really happened, if they wanted to talk about it, Tenya trusted that they would eventually. Until then, he would respect their privacy. But now, I can see you worrying. Tenya turned to see Yaoyorozu faintly smiling at him from her place behind him in the lunch line. While Tenya had of course had the utmost faith in his friends, he was naturally still worried about them while they were gone, and Yaoyorozu had been the only one to notice. Tenya liked to think that the two of them were something like friends now. What's going on? Tenya sighed, pushing his glasses up. I can't help but feel concerned for our friends, he admitted. They'd seemed to bounce back from being taken during the first few days of class, but now they all seem worn thin, I suppose. Yaoyorozu nodded slowly. I can see what you mean, she agreed. They've been retreating into their small group a lot as well, and something is clearly bothering them. The four of them had certainly been a lot more insular, Tenya supposed, since returning from Oregon. He did understand the rest of them had bonded as a class over surviving the villain attack. It only made sense that Midoriya, Uraraka, Todoroki, and Ishido would bond over being taken and sent halfway across the world. Indeed, the two of them got their lunches. I just wish they realized they could come to us for help at least. He might not know Todoroki and Ishido well, but Midoriya and Uraraka were his friends. He hoped they remembered that. Ida and Yaoyorozu. Tenya turned to see Uraraka waving them over, beaming. Maybe they're starting to figure it out, Yaoyorozu murmured gently, as the two of them made their way to the table, neatly becoming a group of 6. Ishido grinned at them. Awesome, you guys can be our tiebreakers. What if they're both split on opinions like the rest of us? Todoroki asked. Ishido waved him off. We'll cross that bridge when we get there. Tenya smiled. Might I ask what we're being called in as tiebreakers for? Sure thing. Uraraka stuffed some more food into her mouth, swallowed, and continued. Okay, hypothetical scenario. You've got a pet that someone has just stolen and is hurting right in front of you, but everyone is just letting them do whatever they want. Then you run into a guy who says he's a time traveler and proves it. He tells you he's there to search for time anomalies, but can't find any. So you borrow his time-traveling device to save your pet. But every time you try to save him, fate twists things so he keeps being taken over and over again. Yaoyorozu frowned. That sounds both horrible and oddly specific. Why is fate conspiring to hurt your pet? And why is no one helping you? Right, Mina agreed vehemently. Could the time traveler help you figure out what's going on? Tenya wondered. Uraraka shook her head. He's too busy going on rides because you're at a fair. Anyways, he eventually does realize, so he comes over and yells at you. But something happens with the time device and you all get sent through a bunch of different time periods, one after another. When you land back in the present, the time police show up and arrest the time traveler for violating the time code, and it turns out you were the anomalies he was meant to look for all along. The time police drag him away, and he swears that he'll go back in time and make sure your parents never meet. This is getting somewhat convoluted, Yaoyorozu admitted. Midoriya chuckled. Trust us, we know. Uraraka laughed. Right. So then a while later the time traveler shows up, having apparently escaped from time prison, and challenges you to gladiatorial combat, where the winner gets to decide the fate of the loser, and makes it very clear that when he wins, he's going to erase you from existence. But you win instead, and get to decide his fate. What do you do? Tenya pondered on this for a moment. Well, it does seem rude to just throw him back in prison. In this hypothetical scenario, he was arrested for a crime that we, the other person in this situation, technically committed, right? Next to him, Midoriya nodded along. But if his job was to stop anomalies, and he instead started the anomaly by letting all of this happen. Then it is technically his fault, and he's very bad at his job, Yaoyorozu countered. Besides, if his solution to this is to challenge us to actual gladiatorial combat with a specific intention of erasing us from existence, then he's committing attempted murder, isn't he? He should be put back in prison. That is true. But if he hadn't been put in prison, maybe he wouldn't have attempted murder in the first place, Tenya argued. Yaoyorozu shook her head. Uraraka specifically said that he threatened to erase us from existence before being put in prison. It was just after he escaped that he put it into practice. An excellent point, and very well thought out. I think I'll agree with you then. Ashido cheered, and Todoroki looked somewhat smug, while Uraraka pouted and Midoriya sighed. Another thought occurred to Tenya. I understand that this was probably only included in the thought exercise as a reason to borrow the time-traveling device, but what happens to the pet? Ashido waved the question off. Oh, he gets turned into a bear immediately after. The person who's taking him doesn't want him anymore, and he can change back whenever he wants, so you take him home and everything ends well. I see, Tenya turned to Yaoyorozu, and she thankfully looked just as befuddled by the conclusion to this plotline as he felt. Midoriya sent him a commiserating grin. Sorry, I know it's kind of strange, but thanks for indulging us. Of course, Tenya agreed immediately. It was a very interesting hypothetical. Even if convoluted, Yaoyorozu added, smiling. And, at the very least, Tenya was relieved to know that his friends still wanted to spend time with him. Katsuki was pissed. This wasn't unusual. He was pissed about a lot of things, a lot of the time. But this had been grating on his nerves for ages now. When they'd been attacked by villains, most of the class stood their ground and fought those bastards. They'd been separated, but they still managed to kick ass. Even shitty hair turned out to be useful. Katsuki had blasted that bastard warp villain and helped save All Might. So why the F was everyone obsessed with the 4 idiots who got themselves sent to America? They didn't even effing do anything, except wait around for 3 days until the pros managed to rescue their sorry asses and take them home. Even Izuku had been useless, and Katsuki had wondered why he'd been so worried about the guy surpassing him. Except the minute they'd come back to school, suddenly Deku could avoid him like it was effing nothing. Suddenly he was looking Katsuki in the eye like they were equals, speaking to him without a trace of his normal idiot stammer, and worst of all, ignoring him, like the thought Katsuki was so beneath him that he wasn't worth bothering with. Except suddenly Round Face had a flashlight that could shrink him down to centimeters and put him in a effing jar. And Raccoon Eyes started casually showing off super strength, which was just as impossible as the fact that Deku had hidden his quirk from him all those years. And apparently that wasn't the only thing Deku was hiding. All 4 of the bastards were suddenly experts in quirkless combat, even though Katsuki knew that Deku had never actually put any sort of effort into becoming a hero besides those dumb notebooks, and certainly hadn't been training like that. Except that they'd all told Aizawa that they'd been training for a few months. All 4 of them had the exact same answer, and every time Katsuki looked over at them from where he was stuck learning the effing basics stuck behind Deku once again, they'd all fought similarly. And when Deku started pulling out the lightning and jumping all over the place like a goddamn pinball, they'd been the only ones who weren't surprised. And there was the little fact about them all suddenly being on a first-name basis. 3 days? 3 days Katsuki's ass. Somehow, they were gone longer than that. He was sure of it. Eventually, he'd gotten sick of the bullshit. Raccoon Eyes seemed the most likely to talk out of the 4 of them, and she also wasn't an emotionless brick wall like Icy Hot or mooning over Deku like Round Face. He slammed an explosion down on her desk, just to get her attention, and when she looked up, Katsuki couldn't help but grit his teeth at the complete lack of care there. Raccoon Eyes raised an eyebrow. You want something? Yeah, Katsuki grit out. The effing truth. How long were you really gone for? Because it was 3 days for us, but it clearly wasn't for you. Don't try to deny it, it's obvious. Bakugou. And there was 4 eyes, charging towards them, hands waving around in the air like a windmill as usual. That's highly inappropriate. They don't have to answer your questions if they don't want to, especially ones that are worded so rudely. Huh? The wording of that statement clicked, and Katsuki grinned. So the class president had figured it out as well. Least that meant he wasn't a total moron. But of course he'd be trying to cover for them like this. What the hell are you talking about? We deserve to know. I mean, they both turned to raccoon eyes. It's not like we really mind. It's not a secret. Now everyone in the class was looking at them. Is it? She wasn't addressing either of them. Out of the corner of his eyes, Katsuki could see Aizawa leaning in the doorway with a tired expression. It's not, their teacher agreed, utterly apathetic. Right. Raccoon eyes shrugged. So if anyone brought it up, we were gonna tell them. Anyone in this class, I mean, not just anyone on the street. But yeah, it was 3.5 months. Now that made a hell of a lot more sense. FERs were doing so well because they'd gotten a boost like that and been able to get ahead of everyone else. Katsuki grinned triumphantly. 3 months? Shitty Hair said. Seriously? That's insane. And then, once again, the class was focused on those four specifically, asking question after question, and there was Deku in the middle of it, bashfully answering questions, the center of attention again despite Katsuki revealing their lies of omission. He growled and started forward. A cold hand rested on his shoulder. Katsuki turned back to see the cold, sharp eyes of Isahat boring into him. Izuku's had enough crazy people obsessing over him, Isahat said shortly. You're not going to be another one. What the F? Katsuki sputtered. You think I'm obsessing over effing Deku? That's exactly what it looks like from my perspective, Isahat told him frankly, in that emotionless tone that Katsuki despised. It looks like you can't stand the idea of him being successful in any way, much less more successful and more well-liked than you. I haven't forgotten how you almost killed him on the second day of school. He dodged, didn't he? Katsuki scoffed. And if he hadn't, you'd be a murderer. For a second, a ghost of a smile flashed across Isahat's face, looking so out of place there that Katsuki almost did a double take. Then it passed, and, looking faintly annoyed, Isahat squeezed his shoulder roughly, before walking past him. Katsuki stood there, no one looking his way, trying desperately to contain his rage. He wasn't obsessed with Deku. He wasn't. He'd fucking show them anyways. Isahat wanted to mock him like that. Deku wanted to defy him and act like he was better than Katsuki. He'd crush them both at the sports festival. He'd crush Raccoon Eyes and Round Face too, but with Isahat and Deku, he'd do it decisively. Then everyone would remember who the best was. Inko was no fool. She'd been so excited when her son suddenly developed his quirk. When he'd gotten accepted into the school of his dreams, she'd planned to encourage him with everything she had. And then suddenly he'd been kidnapped by villains at what was supposed to be the most secure school in the country. After 3 days of going out of her mind with worry, her son and the 3 others who were taken came back. Except for them, it had been over 3 months, and 3 months spent specifically in a world filled with the supernatural. The changes in Izuku from a few days ago were obvious. Plenty of them were good. Izuku seemed so much more settled into his own skin than before. He'd made friends, actual friends, and 3 of them, who clearly loved him dearly just as much as he loved them. He was so open and happy around them, and it made Inko's heart soar. One of them was apparently his girlfriend now, and of course Inko was so happy for him, even if she was also sad that she'd missed all of this. But there were other things as well. There was a sort of heaviness that all 4 of the children, including her son, carried with them. Izuku had nightmares now, ones he certainly didn't before. There was a horribly longing look in his eyes whenever he talked about the people who'd taken him in, people who Inko had never met but already knew she could never repay for taking care of her boy well enough that he spoke of them like this. One of his friends, Mina, had apparently needed to learn how to use a gun. Izuku himself seemed to carry a small knife on him at all times, and seemed so uncomfortable without it that Inko didn't have the heart to bring it up. And again, Inko wasn't a fool. She knew something terrible and dangerous had to have happened to her son and his friends while they were in Gravity Falls. But Izuku refused to tell her. And there was Todoroki Shadow. The second time the boy had snuck over to her house, covered in bruises, Inko proposed the idea of taking pictures of his injuries. For evidence, she'd told him gently, just in case. Because despite the fact that Endeavor, the number 2 hero, someone who the public trusted to protect them, was clearly hurting his son, Shadow refused to leave. Shadow had blinked at her. He's the number 2 hero, he'd said in response, as though the idea of presenting any evidence to someone had a foregone conclusion. As if there was no point in even trying. I know, Inko said gently. But it never hurts to have something recorded, right? Shouto didn't respond for a long moment. Then, okay. So while there wasn't much Inko could do for her son's new friend, at least this was something. And recently, all 4 of them had seemed more serious, more nervous. Something had happened, the first time the 3 of them had run to her house, but Inko didn't know what. Izuku wouldn't tell her. She wanted to tear her hair out with worry, wanted to ask Izuku what she'd done that he didn't trust her with any of this, but she didn't. Not yet. Not while her home seemed to be the only place some of Izuku's friends felt safe in, and Inko was determined to make sure they always felt safe in her home. Hopefully, that would be enough. Fuyumi was afraid. Now, this was nothing new, growing up in the house that she did, with someone like father, where one small misstep, one misplaced word, could spell disaster. Fear was something of an old friend, an emotion she was thoroughly familiar with. And she certainly wasn't unused to fearing for Shouto either. She'd seen how horrified her little brother was when he realized father had hit her, but compared to what he'd done to Shouto, that was nothing. Fuyumi knew that had only been a taste of her brother's pain. It was why she had stayed, even when she turned 18, even when Natsuo moved out the second he could. Despite everything her father had done, to her brothers, to mom, to her, she still loved him. She couldn't stop. But she wasn't delusional. She was well aware of the kind of person he was. And she couldn't bear to leave Shouto all alone in the house with him for years. But while the usual fear for him was still there was more now. Fuyumi always noticed things. It was a central part of how she'd survived for so long in their household, by keeping the peace, noticing things, and understanding how her father and brothers worked. And because of those last 2 skills, it didn't take long to realize that ever since he'd returned from what was apparently a supernatural town in another world's Oregon, something was wrong with Shouto. It wasn't just that sometimes he'd say things that sounded weird at first, but then turned out to be correct. It wasn't the nightmares, he'd had plenty of those before. It was how terrified Shouto seemed to be by it. Like suddenly he was scared of his own thoughts and feelings and knowledge. Fuyumi knew there was something wrong, but she didn't know what to do about it. So whenever she could, she made sure he could escape the house for the night, could talk with his friends, who mostly likely understood what was going on far better than her. And when Shouto came back the next morning mentioning that Midoriya Inko had asked about taking pictures of the bruises father gave him, she'd encouraged him to agree, because evidence had always been destroyed before. But this was something. And so she waited to see if Shouto ever felt safe enough to explain, or if she found a way to better help him. Waited and worried and hoped. The thing was, Ijiro had always counted himself lucky to have a friend like Ashido. She'd defended him from bullies in middle school, after all, and then she'd invited him into her D&D group, and suddenly he had people who were happy to regularly hang out with him. When they'd both gotten into UI, he was ecstatic. And more so when he found out they were in the same class. She was the kind of person who always seemed cheerful, and able to stand up for whatever she believed in, and he couldn't help but admire that, especially as he worked to reinvent himself for this new school. And then, along with Midoriya, Todoroki, and Uraraka, she'd gotten kidnapped at the Usji. And now he knew it wasn't 3 days for them, but 3 months. He'd been so terrified when they couldn't find the 4 of them at the Usji, and so guilt-ridden. If he and Bakugou hadn't jumped in front of 13, the portal villain might not have captured them and sent them away. Or, whatever took advantage of the portal villain to send them to Oregon might not have gotten the chance. Or whatever Midoriya said probably happened. The point was, he'd made things worse for everyone. And yet he was still here, and the meet-up with Ashido and Midoriya and Todoroki, and Ojiro, Ida, and Yaoyorozu, ready to learn some hand-to-hand moves from each other, like nothing had happened, even though it had. But if Ashido could accept him even after that, then Ijiro would greatly take the offered hand. The 8 of them started with basic stretches, before going into different katas and movesets, and eventually spars. And it was a ton of fun. Ijiro was so glad he'd agreed to this. A thought struck him, after one of his spars with Midoriya. You know, when you said you had a teacher who taught you all of this, is she in Oregon? Is that where you learned this all? Yup, Ashido confirmed. Her name is Wendy, and she's amazing. Probably the coolest person I know, Todoroki agreed. Yaoyorozu eyed him, surprised. Really? The coolest? Yeah, no contest. You'd just have to see her in person, Ishido assured Yaoyorozu. I think you'd all like her. Something melancholy flickered in her expression, and it occurred to Ijiro that if they'd been there for months, of course they would have grown attached to the people there. You know, he started hesitantly, if you ever want to, talk about what happened there, I think we'd all listen. Indeed, Ida agreed quickly. You're our friends. If you want to share, we'd be happy to listen. Yaoyorozu and Ijiro quickly chimed in with their own agreements. Midoriya's eyes were watery. Thanks, everyone. Maybe soon, I think. After the meetup was over, they all made plans to come again next week, and Ijiro found himself walking to the train beside Ishido and Todoroki. Oh! Ishido clapped her hands suddenly, and Ijiro jumped a little. Right, I almost forgot. Kirishima, we're introducing Shoto and Ochako to Dungeons & Dragons later today. Do you want to join us? I'd love to, Ijiro agreed immediately. He still thought about his paladin sometimes, and he'd love to make a new character, hopefully one that could survive the entire campaign. Do you have any ideas for characters in mind? Ishido elbowed Todoroki playfully. Well, we finally convinced Shoto not to go with a draconic bloodline sorcerer. He's actually going to play something unique. Todoroki rolled his eyes fondly. Like you weren't the same when you first started, Shooting Star. Ijiro blinked at the nickname, before noting the necklace Ishido had put back on after they were finished sparring. Maybe it was from that. Except both Ishido and Todoroki had suddenly frozen, and Todoroki looked horrified. Then Ishido clapped her hands again. Right, we'll deal with that later. We've got a train to catch for now. Come on. And she led them forwards before Ijiro could ask what was wrong. We're good, then, Mina asked quietly. Izuku took a deep breath and closed his laptop. Yeah, we're ready. Let's do this tomorrow. Ochako rolled the tiny flashlight between her hands as the four of them waited for the guard they knew was coming. We've got 20 minutes, right? Should I shrink you down now? I think so, Izuku agreed. Cameras have already shown us walking away from the area. Going back now, while small, is a good bet. All right then. Ochako hopped off of Izuku's shoulder, held out the miniature flashlight shrunken with the normal light, then set with a tiny chipped-off piece of the size-changing crystal and shrunk the other three down as well, before slipping the flashlight into her bag. The four of them walked over to the main waiting point, where the guard would get into his car. You know, Shoto said, we can hide this from everyone, make it seem like Kurogiri broke himself out, but we'll always know what we did. There's no going back from this. Mina let out a breath and nodded. Yeah, but is it really that different from last time? Sure, before we broke in to prevent a prisoner from escaping, but this time we're saving someone who doesn't deserve to be locked away forever rather than saved, and also making sure we can get in contact with Gravity Falls. It's still for a good cause, and we still can't trust anyone else to get the job done. Ochako laughed lightly. Just like old times, right? We only left Gravity Falls a week ago, Izuku pointed out, but he was smiling. After that, the wait was pretty peaceful. 20 minutes later, the man they were waiting for showed up, already dressed in his Tartarus guard uniform. While he fiddled with his keys, Ochako lifted them all up and into his pocket. They were small enough that when the guard put his keys back into said pocket, they were dwarfed by them. Ochako held her breath, but the guard noticed nothing, and soon enough, there was the telltale sign of the car starting, and they were off towards Tartarus. In the dark of the pocket, she sent her friends a weak smile, one they each returned. It was a long ride. Ochako busied herself by reading a book she'd also shrunk down, while Izuku fiddled with the now tiny laptop, checking over all his programs. 3 hours later, the car slowed down, and the guard got out. They could feel him walking towards the prison and their first checkpoint. Izuku activated his first program, and the scans and metal detectors cleared the guard. They kept going forwards. More scans, more clearances, and then they were in. They could hear footsteps, someone approaching. Iwata, ready for the transfer. Yeah, their guard, Iwata, said. Kurogiri, right? You know why he's being moved so early into his stay here? Something about putting him on a lower level than he's on now, the other person said. Not really our problem, is it? A lower level? They'd known he was being moved, of course. That was why they'd picked this day, and this guard. But lower levels generally meant even more security. Ochako snuck a look at Izuku. Her boyfriend's face was pale, but still determined. Hopefully, that meant everything would still go well. At the very least, they still hadn't been caught. Getting ready for the move took yet more time, sitting through someone important lecturing on moving protocols, which the four of them listened to carefully, in case any of it turned out to be relevant. Then, finally, the move. Once again, Izuku hacked into the different systems so that their presence wasn't picked up, and once again it worked. Because of Magaket's version of tech, Izuku had explained. Ochako sort of thought she understood. Magaket's inventions were weird, unique, and crazy, in a world filled with the weird, unique, and crazy, and still managed to stand out. In their world, technology was a bit more advanced, but Magaket's stuff was so sideways that regular tech didn't seem to know what to do with it. Tartarus was prepared for just about anything. Technology made by a recovering madman in another universe wasn't one of those things. Ochako could hear the sound of Kurogiri being rolled ahead of them. They'd mentioned in the protocol room that he would be asleep for the move, though that wasn't much of a change, as he was asleep most of the time. An additional prevention to keep him from trying to use his quirk, apparently. They entered Kurogiri's new room, and Ochako took a deep breath. They could hear Kurogiri being secured into place, confirmations that everything was hooked up, including brainwave scans and deterrence from even thinking about using his quirk, and then the guards began to leave. Izuku set all the cameras and screens running on a loop, and Shadow gave them a nod. The guards' backs were turned. Ochako clenched her hands into fists, steadied her nerves, and then floated them out of Iwata's pocket and securely in the room, just as the door closed in front of them. They were now alone in the room with Kurogiri. Still the size of a penny, Izuku sat cross-legged on the floor of the prison, checking over his work. Okay, brain scans are set to run on a loop, and so are all of the other sensors. No one will be alerted to anything being wrong until we're out, and I can run the escape program. Viewing panels are still shut, but we don't know if someone is going to enter the viewing room soon, so we should act fast. You know, Mina mused quietly. All of that talk about guns attached to sensors that will fire if prisoners have thoughts about using their quirk. I mean, I know Tartarus is only for the worst of the worst, but I never realized just how inhumane this place is. Even more of a reason to bring back Shirakumo and get us out of here quickly. Shadow looked at his hands, then at the others. Am I good to resize? You are, Izuku confirmed. Ochako took the flashlight back out and shone it on Shadow, turning him back to normal before floating the rest of them onto his shoulder. Shadow looked at Kurogiri for a moment, readied himself, and then his hands lit up with blue flames. Kurogiri practically exploded into mist, letting out an agonizing scream. For a terrible moment, Ochako thought something had gone wrong, that it hadn't worked, that they'd only hurt him more and ruined all their chances of contacting Gravity Falls at all. And then the mist cleared away, the tiny bits of it left reforming into dark clouds. In front of them stood a student who could only be a year or two older than them, with dark stormy cloud hair and yellow pupils, awake, alert, and terrified. What's going on now? Where did you take me this time? What do you want? He paused, taking in Shadow. You're not the doctor. Did they take you too? There was no recognition in his eyes. Did he not remember being Kurogiri at all? I'm not the doctor, Shadow confirmed, unlocking Shirakumo's straitjacket. Shirakumo, right? We're getting you out of here. Desperate hope gleamed in Shirakumo's eyes. That's me. That doctor guy and his employer, they took me. They've been running. They'll come after me. They want to change my quirk. I know, Shadow interrupted shortly. We don't have much time. He held Shirakumo's arm tightly. Listen, this doctor, he did change your quirk, but that was a while ago. I'll explain everything in a minute. But right now, we need to escape. Can you picture a place that's safe? Somewhere no one will think of coming after us? Why, yeah, I can do that. Shirakumo closed his eyes, and in the next moment, they were all enveloped by dark clouds. Another moment passed, and suddenly they were on a rooftop, one extremely close to the UA campus. Shirakumo blinked at his surroundings before stepping back, stunned. That wasn't. Did they already change? Shadow's gaze softened. I'm sorry. Like I said, I'll try to explain what we know. Guys. Got it. Ochako floated her, Izuku, and Mina off of Shadow's shoulder, before resizing them. Hello, Shirakumo. We're really sorry about all of this. We will explain, though. Shirakumo blinked owlishly at them. Right. I'm glad to hear that. Do you think you could do that now? Because I'm very confused at this point. Izuku activated the escape program, before giving him an awkward grin. No problem. 13 years. Shirakumo ran a hand through his hair, which apparently had once been fluffy and blue-white. I was a brainwashed villain for 13 years. Yeah, Izuku confirmed, wincing. There was really no easy way to break it to Shirakumo, but they'd done their best, telling him everything they knew about Kurogiri. It was honestly the least he deserved. We're so sorry about all of this. Shirakumo let out a hysterical laugh. What are you sorry for? That doctor, his employer, they succeeded. They changed my quirk into a warp quirk. They turned me into a villain for 13 effing years. Apparently I just attacked Yua. I attacked Shouta. You guys just made me again. Nothing for you to be sorry for. Which was probably an accurate way to look at things. Izuku still couldn't help but feel bad for putting Shirakumo through all of this, but it was definitely better than just leaving him as Kurogiri when they knew they could help. Shouta? Mina asked. Yeah. You said Eraserhead is your homeroom teacher, right? That's Shouta. He's my friend. Shirakumo paused, a flash of grief overtaking him. Was my friend? Last I remember, we were friends. No way, Mina breathed. Holy shit, Aizawa was young once? The laugh that this startled out of Shirakumo was completely genuine. He smiled at them, and it didn't look nearly as forced as before. He was super short too. Oh my god. Shirakumo laughed again. So he's really a teacher. He never mentioned being interested in teaching. Is he good? I mean, Ochako trailed off awkwardly. Izuku couldn't blame her. He didn't really feel like getting into their issues with Aizawa with the guy who was apparently a close friend of his. Shouto had no such issues. On our first day of school, he had us skip orientation to take a quirk assessment test and threatened to expel whoever ranked the lowest. Shirakumo choked. Seriously? Oh my god, Shouto no. This time it was Izuku's turn to laugh. I mean, other than that he's been pretty good, I guess. We did spend a few months in Gravity Falls after that before returning, so I think that part has just stuck out in our minds. Makes sense. Shirakumo's expression grew more serious. Right, speaking of, you mentioned Gravity Falls, and how Kurogiri's portals got you there and back. I'll definitely try to help if I can, but I don't remember how Kurogiri did it, or got hijacked, or whatever it was. If it doesn't work, then getting you out was still worth it, Ochako insisted. Knowing what we knew, we couldn't just leave you like that. Shirakumo rubbed the back of his neck, smiling. Thanks. I will try to help though, if I can. Speaking of, Mina hedged, maybe don't tell anyone we broke you out. We kind of made it look like Kurogiri broke himself out, so we were hoping to just tell people we found you afterwards. No kidding. Even for a good cause, that probably wouldn't go over well. Shirakumo gave them a thumbs up. It's not like I remember being Kurogiri anyways. If anyone asks, I'll just tell them that the first thing I remember is you guys finding me. Which is true, he paused. Although I'm still legally dead, so I'm not sure who I'd tell or where I'm going to go. Holy shit, I'm legally dead. Izuku winced again even though, like before, he knew that the whole legally dead part wasn't their fault. He couldn't stop a part of himself from feeling guilty that Shirakumo had to deal with this now. You can stay with me, for now, if you want to, he offered. We're all over there most nights anyways, and it's probably the best out of the four of us for houses to go to. Agreed. Ochako played with her hair, a similarly awkward grin on her face. I mean, my parents would also be happy to have you, but we're not exactly in the position to host someone long-term at the moment. And Mina's parents are super weird about who she lets over, and Shouto's dad is a shit stain. If you're okay with it, then sure, Shirakumo agreed easily. Although, do your parents know about this? About me? Oh, right? Mom doesn't know yet, he offered weakly. If you're going to be staying over, We should probably tell her something, I guess. I mean, we'll definitely go with the whole, we found Kurogiri after he escaped and then helped you be you again story, because I don't think she'll react well to the whole thing. But that also means explaining why we really need to contact Gravity Falls right now. He shot a glance at Shadow. His friend grimaced, before nodding slowly, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. If we're going to tell her, I'd like to tell Fuyumi as well. I think, out of everyone, she also deserves to know. Fine with us. Mina nudged him lightly. She's your sister. We trust you on this. Shadow nodded again, looking relieved. At the very least, Izuku mused, he wouldn't have to deal with explaining to his mom alone. Inko opened the door and smiled at the five of them. Come in, Shadow. Your sister is already here. She turned to Shirakumo. And you must be the one Izuku mentioned. It's nice to meet you. Shirakumo smiled. It's nice to meet you too, Miss Midoriya. Oh, you can just call me Inko. She let them in, and Shadow immediately noticed Fuyumi sitting awkwardly on the couch. Her eyes caught his, and lit up as he gave her a wave. As soon as they were all situated, Inko began. All right, so what's going on? Well, this is Shirakumo, and when we found him, he was Kurogiri, Mina blurted out. But he's not Kurogiri anymore, and he wasn't Kurogiri originally, and he's really nice, and he's going to help us connect to Gravity Falls, which we really need to do right now. Shadow's hand smacked against his face. Maybe we should start a little further back than that, Ochako suggested. Together, the five of them wove a mostly coherent story, explaining a bit about Cypher and how Shadow was seeing his memories and having his thoughts, how they ran into the escaped Kurogiri, but because of the weirdness knowledge, already knew he was Shirakumo and changed him back, and how they were trying to get in contact with the shack because they needed help with said Cypher thing. By the end of their very abbreviated tale, Inko's eyes were as wide as saucers. I think I understand, but if you don't mind me asking, Shadow, how did this Cypher get in your head in the first place? Shadow winced. He took over my body for a bit. It wasn't fun. I really don't want a repeat of that, even if it's not exactly the same thing. It won't happen again, Fuyumi vowed, looking close to tears. Shadow desperately wanted to believe her. I knew you were avoiding talking about a lot of your time in Gravity Falls, Inko admitted. I was worried that you didn't want to bring it up because it was dangerous, and your lives were at risk. I was right, wasn't I? You're not telling us most of what happened there, even now. Mom. Inko wiped away the tears that were now streaking down her cheeks. You know you can talk to me about anything, right? Even if you just need someone to listen, I'll always be there. I know, Izuku admitted quietly. There is more that happened, yeah, and a lot of it involves Cypher. I don't know if I want to talk about it now, but maybe sometime? Whenever you're ready, Inko promised. That goes for all of you kids as well. If you need to talk, I'll listen. She turned to Shirakumo. And you're welcome to stay here for as long as you need, Shirakumo. Just be careful, all right? Especially if someone connects you to the Kurogiri who escaped that prison. Shirakumo bowed gratefully. Thanks, Inko. I'll be careful. And actually, you guys can just call me Oboro. I'm more of a first name kind of guy anyways. The group mostly broke up after this, and as soon as they were alone, Shadow found himself swept into one of Fuyumi's hugs. Sorry for worrying you, he murmured. Fuyumi let out a small laugh. You know I'm always worried. We'll figure this out. Whatever we need to do. Shadow swallowed. I almost killed the old man last week. When we were sparring and I started getting Cypher's thoughts, I stopped myself, but I could have what if, the words petered out, and he tried again. I didn't want to kill him, and I didn't, but what if it was you? Or one of my friends? He hated the way his voice cracked. Even after everything, a part of him still protested showing this much weakness to someone. I'm really scared. Fuyumi hugged him tighter. That's not your fault, she whispered. I'm so sorry you had to go through that. We're going to find a way to fix this. In his sister's arms like this, Shadow could almost accept those words as true. And that's homeroom dismissed. Aizawa sighed. Midoriya, Todoroki, Ashido, Uraraka. A word outside. Ochako blinked. She'd had a bit of trouble concentrating the entire period. It was almost as hard to reconcile her teacher with the shy boy Oboro had described as it was to reconcile all might and small might. Still, she got up and followed Aizawa outside the classroom, sharing a confused look with her friends. Aizawa's expression was grave, and Ochako wondered what exactly had happened that he felt the need to tell them privately like this. Kurogiri broke out of Tartarus. Oh, right. Ochako let her eyes go wide. Next to her, Izuku sucked in a breath. They'd have to play this very carefully. I thought it was supposed to be impossible to escape Tartarus, Shadow said flatly. It was, until Kurogiri escaped. Aizawa sighed. Apparently they weren't prepared for a warp quirk as strong as his. Izuku took her hand. Sensei, if you don't mind me asking, why are you telling us this privately instead of letting the entire class know? I know we were sent to Gravity Falls, but everyone was affected by what happened at the Usti. Aizawa's response was blunt. The Hero Commission doesn't want anyone knowing about this, at least until Kurogiri is found. Principal Nedzu insisted that as his most recent victims, you deserve to know the potential threat to your safety. I know the situation isn't ideal, but please don't go telling your classmates this. It was hard enough getting them to agree that you should be informed. Okay. Despite Mina's unhappy expression, she nodded along. Ochako wondered how much of that expression was fake, because some of it did seem real. Even if not for the reasons Aizawa might think. It was hard, not telling him about Oboro. Oboro had vouched for him, but the Aizawa Shouta he had known was a 17-year-old. They didn't know how 30-year-old Aizawa would react. They'd have to tell him, of course. Just, hopefully after they managed to establish contact with Gravity Falls. We'll be careful, Sensei, Ochako promised. According to Izuku and Inko, Oboro was a great houseguest. Despite being a little messy, he was always eager to help out and do his part, and he generally tried to contain his teenage sloppiness to his own spaces. He was also, Mina learned, completely earnest when he promised to try and help them reconnect with Gravity Falls. I've been trying to figure out more about Kurogiri's quirk, to see if I can trigger whatever had the loci thing opening the portal, he admitted, about a week after they'd sprung him from prison. From what I can tell, I need to have a solid picture in mind of a place that I've already been to. And if I haven't been to a place I want to warp to, I need coordinates to get there. Which doesn't really help with getting to Gravity Falls, because it doesn't actually exist here. Which was true. They'd looked it up out of curiosity, and there was no sign that there had ever been a Gravity Falls in Oregon. Mina wondered if Quentin Tremblay hadn't become president in their world, which might have stopped the town from being formed. What does happen if you try to make a portal to Gravity Falls? Mina wondered curiously. Oboro concentrated, and a circle of storm clouds appeared, fluffier and more solid than the purple mist of Kurogiri, but still not quite the clouds he apparently had for his original quirk. The portal doesn't connect, just hovers here. We can hang on, we're connecting. And then, in front of all of them, the portal became clear, and Mina could see Ford and Stan on the other side. There was a sort of ping as Mina felt the touch of the genus loci again. Next to her, Shadow started, and judging by the look he gave her, he'd felt it too. Connection established, Ford crowed. This is only a viewing portal, but it shouldn't take long now to make one we can actually cross. Kids, it's so good to see you. For a moment, they all just sat there, stunned. Then Mina wiped her eyes and beamed back. It's good to see you both too. We missed you. And she really had. It was so good to see them again. Stan chuckled. You miss us already? It's only been a couple of weeks on our side. That's gotta have been nothing for you. Izuku blinked, quickly wiping away his tears. Actually, it's been a couple of weeks for us as well. Have our worlds' times sync together? Can that happen with just a couple jumps between them? It shouldn't, Ford admitted, looking baffled. Two worlds might start flowing a bit more in sync, but it takes a lot for them to perfectly match up like this. He frowned. Unless they were originally in sync, and something decided to temporarily make them out of sync. But it'd have to be pretty powerful to do something like that. Such as a genus loci, which we realized was the thing that brought us both in and out of Gravity Falls by hijacking Kurogiri's portals, Shadow suggested quietly. Maybe so that we could help with a potential weird Mageddon, and then be home in no time at all. There was a moment of silence as they all digested this. Stan winced. Geez, that's some freaky level of preparation. But not impossible for something like the living consciousness of Gravity Falls itself. Ford tapped his chin, intrigued. It might not have been powerful enough to stop Cypher, but it could nudge things in place for his defeat. Fascinating? Right, Cypher. Ochako was the first to breach the subject. We've got some bad news on our end. Well, not everything is bad, you know the portal villain? Well, he's not a villain anymore. Turns out he was brainwashed and experimented on, and now he's himself again. She looked around, even though they all knew Inko was out of the house at the moment and couldn't overhear them. Although we did need to break him out of prison to help with this. Oboro leaned over so that Stan and Ford could see him and waved awkwardly. Hey there, I'm Oboro. Nice to meet you. Ford smiled. I had wondered why the portal seemed so different this time. It's nice to meet you as well, Oboro. Next to him, Stan looked even more delighted. Broke him out of prison, you say? You didn't get caught, did you? We made it look like Kurogiri broke himself out, Izuku told him. Our story is that we found him after he broke out and helped him become Oboro then. That's my kids, great job. I want a play-by-play later, you hear? Mina couldn't help but laugh. Even with everything that had happened lately, there was still something so comforting in Stan being Stan. You got it. She sobered. Right, but the bad news is, we have a serious problem. Cypher, he's not exactly dead. Or he is dead, but part of him isn't. Shadow's getting his thoughts and memories. Stan and Ford both froze. You're kidding. Shadow shook his head. I think it started after Weirdmageddon. It wasn't noticeable at first. But now, I keep seeing things and knowing things I shouldn't know and thinking things that I wouldn't usually think, and I don't know how to make it stop. Ford's eyes widened. Your fire. It's pure chaos energy, and it must contain some of his essence. If he wanted to rebuild himself after death, he grimaced. It still wouldn't be him, his soul is still destroyed, and it would still be Shadow's soul that everything would be built around, but only by technicality. You're saying he might be trying to make Shadow into a copy of himself, Izuku said, clearly trying hard to keep his voice from wavering. Ford grimaced. Cypher is over 1 trillion years old. If Shadow were to receive all of his memories, his 15 years of life would be quickly overwhelmed. And this new Cypher would already have a physical form. No bargaining or rifts required. Shadow looked sick. Mina leaned over and pulled him into a side hug. Ochako and Izuku leaned in on the other side. Stan's hands balled into fists. Great, so how do we stop it? After everything it took to get rid of the bastard, we're not going to let him kill Shadow's personality and turn him into another Cypher. Absolutely not, Ford agreed. The trick will be how. I can create a charm that'll suppress Cypher's influence for the time being, but hearing how much Shadow's already been affected, it'll eventually be like putting duct tape on a damn leak. If we want to permanently fix this, we're going to need to invoke something even more powerful than Cypher, which is always a risk. More powerful than Cypher? Ochako repeated. Is there something like that out there? There is, Ford confirmed. It's called the axolotl. I've seen theories that it's some sort of anti-Cypher. Cypher's cosmic opposite, so to speak. Making the charm shouldn't take long, about a week, and we can use that as a temporary solution until the axolotl is contacted. He sighed. But again, with beings as powerful as that, there's always a risk involved. The alternative is whatever's left of Bill Cypher, left of Cypher trying to use me to fuck up our reality, Shadow grit out. I'll take the risk. Agreed, Izuku piped up. We've stopped Cypher plenty of times before, right? We can do it again. Exactly. Mina squeezed Shadow's side tightly. We still defeated Cypher, back during Weirdmageddon. This is just getting rid of the leftovers. As soon as we can get the portal running as an actual portal, we'll come over, Ford promised. Oboro, is there any way you can keep this viewing portal open? Oboro seemed to concentrate, before nodding. Yeah, it seems to be kind of like how my clouds were once I make them. They stay there until I dissipate them. That's got to be useful for making a stable portal, right? Oh yes, that'll make things so much easier. Thank you. Ford is on the case, Ochako said to Shadow, as Oboro moved the viewing portal to a corner of the room. It's going to be okay. Shadow hesitated before nodding. Yeah, it will. Do you? Izuku hesitated. Do you want to talk about it? Shadow stared at the ceiling. After their talk with Stan and Ford, he couldn't help but feel like his emotions had just been through the washing machine, twisted and spun in all different directions, coming out wrinkly and almost unrecognizable. It's stupid, he finally said, but it feels unfair. I made a stupid mistake months ago, and now it keeps coming back. Over and over again. It feels like I never stopped being his puppet. You're not. I know, but I don't need to hear that right now. He ran a hand through his hair in aggravation. He thought about his arms, still wrapped up in bandages, about seeing Mina fall off that cliff, about the fire that was still occasionally out of his control, of Cypher calling him a puppet over and over, of almost killing his father, of slipping up and calling Mina shooting star. Why? His voice wobbled involuntarily. Why can't he just leave me alone already? He's dead, and he's still effing me over. Why can't this just stop? No one had anything to say to that, but Shadow could feel his friends hugging him tighter. Are we ready? Ochako gave Ford a thumbs up. All ready on this end. You're good to come over. Excellent. With that, Ford walked up to the newly made portal and stepped through it, followed shortly by Stan, with Wendy and Suze coming through after them. Izuku could hardly believe it. Even though this was what they'd been working for, it was still so strange to see everyone in his house, and not the other way around. Mina let out a happy shout and ran towards them. Izuku laughed and followed, and a moment later they were all wrapped in a large group hug. It's really good to see you guys again, Shadow murmured. Suze hugged him tighter. Agreed, we missed you. Come on guys. It's only been, 3 weeks? Wendy laughed as they all disentangled from each other. Candy, Grenda, and Pacifica say hi. By the way, they would have come as well, but they've got school. And you don't? Ochako wondered. Wendy grinned. That's the fun part about college. School doesn't actually start for another couple of weeks. It's nice to finally meet you all, Mom said warmly. I've heard such nice stories about all of you. She turned to Stan. And I wanted to thank you especially for looking after my son while he was in your world. Fayumi nodded alongside her. Likewise, thanks for looking after Shadow. Stan waved her off, but he was smiling. It was nothing. They're all pretty good kids. He reached out and ruffled Izuku's hair. Can't wait to see them kick ass tomorrow in this sports festival thing. Agreed. Of course, unfortunately, we're not just here for that. Ford turned to Shadow. Has it gotten worse since we last spoke? Shadow shrugged, looking somewhat uncomfortable. Not exactly. It's been pretty consistent, but that still means dealing with at least one bit of weirdness knowledge or cipher thought or memory a day. Last night, he trailed off, staring into the middle distance before shaking his head and refocusing on the present. Cipher whatever he did to his home dimension, it was bad. Ford nodded gravely. Unsurprising. According to him, he destroyed it. Fayumi turned to her brother, concerned. You didn't mention this before. I didn't really want to think about it, Shadow admitted. Like I said, it was bad. He turned back to Ford. Is the charm ready? Almost, Ford confirmed. It's done enough that I can bring everything over and work on it over here. It should be finished by tomorrow afternoon, at the latest, which means I'll probably be missing most of the sports festival. Apologies. It's okay. I'd rather have it done sooner. I'm so sick of this. Mina nudged Shadow gently. Still, that's good news, right? Just one more day, and then we'll contact this axolotl guy and never deal with Cypher again. Izuku really hoped so. He was more than sick of Cypher screwing with their lives, and he knew that everyone else felt the same. And in the meantime, we've got the sports festival, Ochako chimed in. I'm so excited for it. How do these sports festival things usually go? Suze wondered. Well, the first 2 events are random, so we don't exactly know what will happen, Izuku explained. But by the end of the second event, there are always 16 students left, and then we go into a tournament bracket. The last person standing wins the festival. Mina turned to Oboro. What about your sports festivals? How did they go? Oboro smiled, reminiscing. Well, when I was a first year, we had a massive escape room type event first, and the first 32 to escape moved on. Then we were split up in 2 teams for capture the flag, and whichever team won moved on to the tournament. Shouta actually won the whole thing that year. That's when he got transferred into the hero course from Gen Ed. Izuku blinked. I mean, with a quirk that erases quirks, I can see why he won, especially if the hero course students didn't know much about quirkless combat at the time. But I didn't know Aizawa was originally a Gen Ed student. Yeah, I think that was why he was kind of standoff-ish originally. He felt like he had a lot to prove. It took a while for Hisashi and I to get him to realize that we really did want to be friends. Awa, that's so sweet, Minakued. Did they really not teach kids who were training to be literal heroes how to fight without their quirks? Wendy asked Oboro, sounding somewhat incredulous. Oh, we learned eventually, Oboro assured her. Just not in time for the sports festival. We've been working on it a bit in class, Shouto added. But we also have Aizawa as our homeroom teacher, so maybe he realized it would be better to start early. Plus, a few of us have been sparring on weekends in our own time. Speaking of, Izuku remembered. If you guys are gonna stick around for a couple days, there are a few of our classmates who really wanted to meet you, Wendy. Since we mentioned that we all learned how to fight from the same person, they wanted to know if they could get some tips as well. Sure, why not? Sounds cool. What is the plan for watching the sports festival? Mom wondered. We could all watch it here, although I suppose the living room might get a little crowded. Actually, Fayumi said, Father bought a skybox, but then got called in to help work internal security for the event. And even when he's off the clock, he has no plans to actually use it. He'd rather be closer to the action, I guess. She winced, and Shouto sighed. But the point is, since he has no plans for using it, we could use it instead. Fine by me, Suze agreed immediately. A skybox seat sounds awesome. Indeed. I'll most likely catch what I can from here while I'm working on the charm, but the rest of you should go enjoy. I'll stay here too, Oboro said. Probably better for me not to show up at the actual festival. Unless Ford gets done with the charm early, then I could bring him over. Maybe portal outside the stadium if that happens, Izuku suggested. I wouldn't be surprised if there's something in place to prevent warp quirks after the Usje. He winced, but Oboro just smiled back. Yeah, that would make sense. I'll do that then. Sounds like a plan. Mom clapped her hands together happily. Now, who wants katsudon? We should have a big dinner before the kids' big day. Izuku immediately perked up. Yes, please. I've never had it, Wendy admitted, as they followed Mom into the kitchen. Is it good? It's great, Izuku assured her. You'll love it, I promise. Says the guy who readily admitted that it's his favorite food, Mina snickered. Exactly. I know that it's great. Oh, maybe we could have matcha for dessert, Ochako added. I've certainly got the ingredients to make some, Mom agreed, putting on her apron. Fayumi grabbed another apron right after her. I'll help. I love cooking. Izuku smiled before turning to Shouto, who was still looking off into the distance. Are you excited? For the sports festival? Shouto shrugged. I guess. I think I'm more excited for everything to be over, though. That made sense. Izuku certainly couldn't blame him. If it were him, he'd be a lot more focused on getting that charm as well. But Ford was almost finished, so everything would hopefully work out fine. They'd all do well at the festival, and then they'd come home, and Shouto would get the charm, and they could finally start moving on from Cypher. He had a good feeling about tomorrow. The next morning, Stan made pancakes for everyone, and afterwards, there was a last-minute scramble as they grabbed their things. You're bringing the size-changing light? Ochako wondered, as Izuku packed said light. Aren't we not allowed accessories and support items as hero course students? You're not? Wendy wondered. Are the other courses? That seems kind of unfair. Apparently, it's because of our extra training, which, for hero students that aren't the 4 of us, is an entire month. Clearly, we're way too ahead of everyone. Mina rolled her eyes before taking a leaf out of Izuku's book and packing her grappling hook. We do actually have training in how to use our quirks, even if it's only a month of training, Izuku pointed out sensibly. The other courses don't even get that. I'm packing the light just in case, I I don't think I'll get the chance to use it, but it's better safe than sorry, right? Definitely. I'll record everything in high definition, Inko promised, as they headed out the door, along with everyone who was going to the skybox. We're rooting for you. Kick some butt, Oboro agreed. Mina gave them a thumbs up. You got it. We'll give you guys a great show. Even though they left early, the train was still packed, and the area around and inside the US Stadium was already starting to fill up. Thankfully, as students and family of students, they were allowed to bypass the crowds and head through a side entrance. As soon as they stepped into the area designated for the festival, Shadow winced. Is it just me, or does something feel weird? The rest of them turned to look at him. Just you, Stan said. What kind of weird? Mina asked. Shadow tapped the side of his head, as if trying to dislodge some water in his ear. I don't know. It just feels off. Fuyumi gripped her brother's shoulder tightly. We'll keep an eye on it, Wendy promised. Stan whistled as the smell of freshly made food wafted over to them. Oh, they've got to have some great stalls here. We should check them out before heading up to our seats. This is a campus for heroes in training, Ochako reminded him, amused. Try not to steal anything, or at least try not to get caught. Stan put a hand to his chest, mock offended. Who, me? Never. I'm far too good to get caught. They all shared a bit of a chuckle. Seriously though, you kids should go get prepared, or whatever it is you need to do. I want to see you wipe the floor with those other brats, you hear? That's not exactly what the sports festival is for, Fuyumi protested, but she was smiling. Shadow looked up at his sister. I mean, that kind of is what the sports festival is for. We're gonna kick ass and take names, Mina promised, smiling. Stan ruffled her hair, and Fuyumi gave Shadow one last hug. That's the spirit. Good luck, dudes. Yeah, we're rooting for you. You got this. You know, Izuku mused happily as they made their way towards the waiting room for Class A. I never imagined that we'd actually have the rest of the Mystery Shack here to cheer us on during the sports festival. I know things aren't completely ideal, but part of it still feels like the best of both worlds, you know? It's gonna be a lot more fun, Shadow agreed. They split up at the locker rooms, and Mina changed into her gym uniform. A part of her was bummed that she couldn't wear her costume, but considering the fact that she had a few possible changes and additions in mind, maybe it wasn't the worst thing in the world. When she and Ochako entered the main room, the boys were already there, as well as a few others: Ada, Ajiro, Tokoyami, and Sato, as well as Jiro and Hagakure. Slowly, the rest of the class filed in, the room filling with nervous energy. I wonder what the first round's gonna be, Sato mused, clenching his shaking fists together. I mean, I know it's random, but... Is it actually random? Izuku wondered. I mean, they already have everything for the events prepared, so even if they do that wheel spin they always do, I don't think it's actually randomized. I guess that's fair. No matter what comes, we have no choice but to deal with it, Tokoyami mused. Yayurazu was the last to enter, and Mina grinned and waved at her. You ready for this? Yayurazu gave her a nervous smile. I suppose so. At this point, we've prepared all that we can, haven't we? We'll just have to make sure it all pays off. That's a good way to look at it, Ajiro agreed, although he seemed just as nervous. Frankly, besides Bakugou, who never really looked scared about anything, it seemed to be just the mystery crew who weren't dealing with nerves. It did make sense. They'd faced plenty of life or death scenarios, stopped the apocalypse, and, most recently, broken someone out of Tartarus. After all of that, Mina just couldn't bring herself to feel nervous about a school tournament. Even if it was a bummer that she couldn't bring her grappling hook into the events proper, she was still confident enough in her skills that she knew she was going to succeed. Besides, Stan, Suze, Wendy, and Fuyumi were watching from one of the skyboxes. Ford, Oboro, and Inko were watching at Izuku's house. Mina's parents were probably watching back at home, although they hadn't really mentioned it. Mina certainly wasn't going to let any of them down. Ida, who had left a few minutes ago, slammed the door open. Everyone, are you ready? We'll be entering soon. Mina shared a smile with Ochako and Izuku, and a nod with Shadow. They were definitely ready. Hey, pay attention, audience, swarm, mass media. This year's high school rodeo of adolescence that you all love, The UA Sports Festival is about to begin. Everybody, are you ready? It's time for the first-year students to enter the stage. Ochako took a deep breath, then let it out. The miraculous new stars who overcame enemy attacks with their hearts of steel. Hero Course, Class 1A. At present Mike's cue, they headed out of their entrance and into the stadium. There was a brief flash of nerves. There were a lot of people, all screaming at the top of their lungs, as fireworks exploded above them. Ochako reminded herself that she'd already been through something like this in Globnar, and unlike Globnar, the people running the tournament actually cared whether they lived or died, and so weren't going to make any challenges that were actually deadly. There's a lot of people looking at us, isn't there? Kaminari noted next to her, grinning awkwardly. Will we be able to give our best performance while being watched by so many people? Ida wondered. Although perhaps this is also part of the training required to become a hero. Learning how to work well under pressure is a must, Yaoyorozu agreed. He's really going overboard with the praise, Kirishima said. I mean, I know we fought villains and all, but still, it's kind of making me more nervous. Mina punched his arm. Hey, if you can fight villains, then you can deal with being praised by our teacher. Kirishima laughed, looking slightly less tense than before. That's true. I guess I should only really be nervous if Aizawa's the one praising us. That would just be weird. Ochako really wanted to mention the story Oboro told them about how Aizawa had seemed so intimidating when he first joined their class after being transferred over, and then almost immediately tripped on his scarf during fundamental heroics, but of course couldn't, and so she held her tongue. As they walked, Present Mike called out Class B, as well as the business, support, and general studies departments, all of which received considerably less praise than their class did, even 1B. Ochako supposed it was because their class was already well known, but she did feel a bit bad for them. Finally, all of them made it to the center, where Midnight stood on a podium. Time for the player pledge. Representing the students is bakugou Katsuki from 1A. Ochako took this in, then immediately sighed. Next to her, Izuku winced. He's gonna say something dumb, her boyfriend muttered. Get everyone all riled up and put more pressure on himself. Shoto shrugged. Let him. Makes it easier for us, doesn't it? Sure enough. I pledge that I'll be number 1. Immediately, the rest of the classes rang out with boos, including shouts directed towards all of Class A, calling them all full of themselves. Izuku let out a long sigh, and Ochako patted his shoulder commiseratingly. I'd say that he should have at least not gotten the rest of us caught up in it, but that really is just like him, Mina noted cheerfully. Stan probably likes him now, though. Hell yeah, you tell them, kid, this is gonna be hilarious. Suze squinted. Hey, isn't that the dude Izuku was talking about when he mentioned someone tried to explode him on their second day of class? And basically almost murdered him? Stan paused, then continued his yelling. Screw you, kid, Izuku's gonna kick your ass. That'll be hilarious. Now, let's get started right away, Midnight announced. She raised her hand, and a holographic projection of the usual sports festival wheel sprung up, spinning around like a slot machine. This year, the first event is an obstacle race. All 11 classes will participate in this race. The course will be the outer circumference of this stadium, about 4 kilometers. She smirked at them. Our school's selling point is freedom. As long as you stay on the course, it doesn't matter what you do. Now, take your places, everyone. An obstacle course, huh? Ochako could get behind that. It wasn't perfect for her. Her quirk might make her a little faster, and her power might help with obstacles, but neither would help much for running a long distance like this. Still, she felt confident. She turned to Izuku with a smile. This is perfect for you. You can show off full cowling. Izuku grinned back. Right, I've never held it for an entire 4 kilometers though, so this should also be a good way to test how long I can maintain it. They lined up at the entrance to the obstacle race. The lights above them counted down. 3, 2, 1, go. Ochako dashed forwards, but found herself immediately bottlenecked by everyone else, smushed between dozens of people trying to push themselves forward at the same time as her. She almost laughed out loud. Hadn't she just been thinking that a race wasn't a good showcasing of her skills? Apparently she was already wrong. Concentrating, she lifted herself and the rest of the mystery crew above the crowd, ignoring the surprised shouts around her, and floated them over the other students and out the other side of the tunnel. Mina flashed her a smile, jumping onto her acid and zooming forwards. "Thanks for the lift." "No problem." They weren't the only ones who had that idea. Behind them, Ochako could hear Yaoyorozu, Bakugou, Ajiro, Aoyama, Ida, Takoyami, and Mainta, all having cleared the tunnel as well. From in front of them, Ochako could hear a rumbling sound, and the faux robots from the entrance exam came into view. Plenty of them were the 1, 2, and 3-point villains, but behind all of those, the 0-pointers loomed. So this is what they used in the entrance exam, Shouto wondered. Then he let out a small huff that, coming from Shouto, was the equivalent of a laugh. "Well, we are supposed to show off, right?" "Oh, that looks painful." Fayumi winced at the mass of students all bunched together in the tunnel. "No kidding," Suze agreed. "Wouldn't want to be them?" "Oh hey look, it's our dudes." Sure enough, Wendy could see Ochako floating herself and the others above the crowd, landing neatly on the other side. Immediately afterwards, the acid Mina had talked about having but Wendy had never seen appeared under her feet, and she glided forwards, while Izuku lit up with green lightning and raced forwards even faster. "Well," Suze added, "I guess we know why he was Sparks now." Wendy nodded along, her eyes widening as the massive robots came into view. "Oh shit, look at those things, they're so cool." "They've reached the first obstacle," the banana-haired hero doing the announcements declared. "Robo Inferno." Next to her, Stan winced. "Those things are crazy. And they're not allowed any gear? Are we sure this school cares about their well-being?" "They'll be fine," Fayumi assured him. "If nothing else, Shouto can handle this." Wendy turned to her curiously. "Really?" Fayumi blinked. "Oh, right, I forgot for a moment that he didn't have his quirk while in your world. You know he can control fire and ice, right?" "He mentioned it once, but never really went into detail," Wendy admitted. Stan leaned back in his seat, munching on some takoyaki. "I know he was really moping around for a while when he first arrived because he was upset about losing it. Guess now we'll see what all the fuss was about." On the screen, Shouto moved in front of the other three. He lowered his hand, and around him, the ground froze in a perfect circle. Then he swung his hand upwards, and suddenly, all of the giant robots were completely frozen. The takoyaki dropped out of Stan's mouth. "Holy shit. Dude did not tell us he could do that," Suze agreed. Wendy turned to Fayumi. "Can you?" Shouto's sister laughed nervously. "Well, I never really got much training, not like Shouto did, but I suppose I used to freeze the entire garden by accident when I first got my quirk. I couldn't unfreeze it though, since I don't have a fire quirk like he does." The mystery crew ran between the frozen robot's legs, and immediately after, it toppled over. Stan leaned forward, delighted. "Oh, he froze it while it was on an angle so no one else could get through. Nice going, kid." "And that's Todoroki from Class 1A. He attacked and defended in one hit, with only 3 others getting through. How elegant. It's, practically unfair." Mina rolled her eyes. "Geez, biased much, Mike-sensei? What are you calling him unfair for?" She slid ahead of the person in question, making sure to cross in front of him. "Keep up, Shu." She could practically hear Shouto's eye roll, as the ground under him froze once more, using his ice to propel him forwards so that he could keep up with her. And ahead of them both, Izuku bounded forwards, full cowling on full display. Mina could hear him laughing with joy as each step covered more and more ground. "I should have left you guys in the tunnel," Ochako groaned from behind them, but Mina could see that she was smiling too. Before she knew it, they were at the next obstacle. A massive fall, with pillars of cement, probably molded by Cementos, reaching up to their height, wires connecting each pillar from one side to the other. Ochako ran forward, grinning at them. "Use your own skills this time." With that, she floated herself up and over the obstacle, avoiding it completely. No problem, really. Fighting Blendon on a unicycle that was on top of a tightrope during one of those Globnard challenges was much harder. Mina kept running, moving her acid and making sure it was at a low enough solubility that it wouldn't burn through the wires, and kept moving. On another wire, Shouto did the same with his ice. Meanwhile, Izuku jumped on one of the wires and used it to springboard onto another, forwards and forwards, keeping up with Ochako as best he could. "Look at them go," Suze cheered. "Some of the other students are still just leaving the Robo Inferno obstacle. Although now I'm kind of rooting for that girl who pulled a cannon out of her stomach." "I know, right?" Wendy agreed. "That was awesome." They watched as their kids cleared the fall and moved onwards, while others approached. "Looks like the girl with the frog quirk is going to do really well on this one," Fuyumi noticed. "Dude, that girl's got hover boots to go with her grappling gear. She's so cool and steampunk." "No kidding. Bet Mina's gonna want to talk to her after this." "Did you see that support course student's hover boots? I've got to talk to her after this." Ochako nodded emphatically. Agreed. If the massive signs with the skulls on them weren't enough, it was pretty obvious by the ground that the last obstacle course was a minefield. Shadow debated using his flames to hover himself over it, like what Ochako was doing, but decided against it. Despite them working with Oboro, there was still the chance they could backfire, and something that he could easily use his quirk to get across wasn't worth risking it for. An ice path would do just fine. They were about halfway across the minefield when Shadow heard the telltale explosions of their classmate. He looked behind him to see Bakugou propelling himself forwards by his explosions, aiming not above them, but right towards Shadow specifically. "I'm coming for you, half and half bastard." "Someone's got issues," Mina muttered next to him. Shadow watched Bakugou get closer. A thought struck him, and he smiled, putting his hands out to intercept Bakugou. "Hey, Bakugou. What happens when a sudden temperature difference displaces the air?" "What the hell are you?" Before he could finish, Shadow's quirk finished its job, and Bakugou was knocked backwards and out of the air by a strong gust of wind, landing on one of the mines and exploding even further back. Shadow took the chance to keep skating forwards. Mina whistled. "When did you figure that out?" Shadow blinked and considered. Literally right this second. He supposed it wasn't the worst weirdness knowledge he could have gotten. Aside from learning about Oboro, most of the time knowledge popped into his head, it was either horrifying or useless. At least this actually helped him better use his quirk. He'd have to work on it more later. Ochako spoke up. "Hey, have either of you guys seen Deku at all during this minefield?" There was a massive explosion in the back, and suddenly a streak of green was propelled forwards. For a moment, Izuku hovered above them, hanging upside down, and he flashed a peace sign before landing in a roll and exploding himself even further, clearing the entire minefield in seconds. Shadow let out an incredulous laugh and followed. Stan stuffed another takoyaki in his mouth. This was the first time he'd ever had the food, and clearly he'd been missing out. "Oh man, this obstacle is the best. Look at how they're all popping up in the air like that." Wendy squinted at the screen. "What's Izuku doing? It looks like he's just digging up mines and stacking them together at the beginning of the field." "Is that Katsuki guy going right for Shadow?" Suze wondered. "Oh, he is. Oh wow, I thought Shadow's quirk was just ice and fire." Fuyumi looked just as confused. "It is? I don't. Oh, a displacement of temperature in the air can create wind. I didn't even think about that. Great job, Shadow." "Guys, holy shit, he's jumping on all of the mines," Wendy interrupted, grinning widely. Stan whooped as Izuku flew over the entire minefield and into first place. "You're crazy, kid, I love it." And Midoriya has taken the lead once again. "Eraserhead, your class is amazing. What are you teaching them?" Full cowling was amazing. Izuku bounded forwards, pushing himself as hard as he could without going over his current limit with One for All. Almost there. He could hear Ochako, Shadow, and Mina right behind him, and he grinned, despite himself. He definitely wanted to win, but all four of them coming in first through fourth felt right. He was in the tunnel now. Just a little further, and then back into the sunlight. And the winner is Midoriya Izuku from Class 1A, followed by Todoroki, Ashido, and Uraraka, all also from Class 1A. Izuku stopped to catch his breath, and was immediately tackle-hugged by Ochako. He laughed as they both landed on the ground, delighted. After a moment, Shadow helped him to his feet, smiling. Way to show off full cowling to the pros. Izuku laughed awkwardly. "Yeah, probably better than introducing myself to the world of heroes by breaking my fingers, right?" Mina bounced on the tips of her toes, beaming. "That's the first event cleared. only 2 more to go. Behind them, Bakugou charged into the stadium, followed by Shiozaki and Honuki from 1B, Ida, Yaoyorozu, Tokoyami, and the others. Mina was right. They'd cleared the first event, and they'd done it spectacularly. Now, on to the next one. Midnight gathered the top 42 students into the center of the stadium to begin the next event. The top 42 made it to the next round. It's unfortunate, but don't worry even if you didn't make it. We've prepared other chances for you to shine. The real competition begins next. The press cavalry'll be all over it. The holographic wheel spun again and landed on Cavalry Battle. Midnight turned to the board as a funny image of the teachers, including 13, present Mike, and allmight popped up. Let me explain. The participants can form teams of 2 to 4 people as they wish. It's basically the same as a regular cavalry battle, except that people have been assigned a point value based on the results of the obstacle course. The points assigned go up by 5 starting at the bottom. The assigned points for each person popped up on the board. Mina scanned the top, looking for her name, and was immediately drawn to Izuku's instead. 10 million? Next to her, Izuku let out a quiet, "Oh no." Midnight smirked. That's right. It's survival of the fittest, with a chance for those at the bottom to overthrow those at the top. She went on to explain the rules of the cavalry battle, and how the top rider would wear a headband with the group's total number of points. The goal would be to grab the other group's headbands within the time frame of 15 minutes. Headbands could only be worn from the neck up. Quirks were allowed, but red cards would be given for deliberately trying to make other teams fall. You have 15 minutes to build your teams, Midnight announced. Start. Mina immediately turned to the rest of the mystery crew. So how are we going to play this? We've got the biggest target on our backs now, and by a long shot. Ochako should ride on top, Shouto said immediately. With her power, she has the best chance at both snatching headbands and defending ours from being stolen. I could also just lift us over people's heads if need be, Ochako agreed. Which is definitely a strategy we can use. Izuku nodded. Yeah, Ochako as rider is the best. Besides the fact that her power will work regardless of her placement, being on top is still best suited to her. And with Mina's strength, plus her acid, my full cowling, and Shouto's ice, us being on the bottom means good maneuverability whenever we're on the ground. Shouto's power is best for frontal attacks and defense in this instance, so he should also go in front. While Mina and I each take a wing, we could always play defensive, because as long as no one takes our headband, we've got an instant win condition. But again, with Ochako's power, if need be we can also steal headbands that way. Man, Mina was lucky her friends were so smart. There might be a lot of teams who come after us at once. What should we do then? I can always make ice walls to separate us from the rest, Shouto pointed out. I'm sure there are quirks that can blast through them. But not every team will have one of those, and especially not one that can blast through quickly, which will give us more time to deal with whatever team does get through. Like whatever team has Kaken on it. Izuku grimaced. I wouldn't be surprised if he goes for us immediately. Then Izuku tapped his chin, his look becoming more thoughtful. Or maybe not. He might decide to build up a lot of other headbands before coming after us. That way, even if we take one, he probably figures that we can't take them all. Ah, the complexities of whatever the hell goes on in that guy's head, Mina sighed dramatically. But yeah, that all sounds like a plan to me. Plus, we're pretty good at coming up with stuff on the fly. If our plans need to change during the battle, I'm sure we can work around whatever problem we have. Her gaze drifted over to the pink-haired support course girl, who'd made it into the cavalry battle and was now talking with Ida, Yaoyorozu, and Tokoyami. Hey, do you think after this I can ask her about making me a temporary grappling hook for the tournament? It feels so weird, not having mine. You should go for it, Shouto encouraged. Maybe once we're done fighting each other, though. When it came to the 4 members of their class that had been kidnapped, never had the discrepancy between their skills and the skills of the rest of the class been more apparent than in the obstacle course. Those 4 had dominated the race. It hadn't even been a contest. Even when Bakugou had gotten close, Todoroki had thrown him back with a gust of wind. Momo hadn't even known he could do that. She wondered why he hadn't used it back in the recommendation race against that one boy with the wind quirk. It wasn't just their individual skill, however. Even in the race, where the event was every student for themselves, they'd helped each other without even thinking, creating openings and laughing together and teasing each other while the rest of the students struggled. And she knew those skills had come at a price. 3 entire months trapped in a foreign country, away from everything they'd ever known, had to be hard, no matter how much they played it off. And considering their strange new abilities, and how much they brushed around talking about what happened to them, their Momo wondered if something much more dangerous had happened in Oregon, something that the 4 of them weren't talking about. The rest of them had fought villains, but those 4 seemed even more experienced, so what exactly had they been through? With all that in mind, it was personally hard to be too upset at them. Momo, for her part, was very glad that at this point, she could reasonably count them as friends, having sat with them at lunch for the past few weeks, as well as sparring with them on Saturdays. In fact, because of their spars, she'd been able to easily react to Minta attempting to stick himself to her and stop his attempts. Now, however, watching how the 4 immediately turned to each other to strategize, unconcerned about the target Midoriya's 10 million would paint on them, Momo couldn't help but feel a pang of envy. They were so tight-knit, and she wished she could have something like that as well. She felt a hand on her shoulder and looked up to see Ida smiling at her. "Apologies if I startled you. I was wondering if you'd like to be on my team." "I'd love to," Momo agreed, relieved. Ida was another person she'd found herself becoming close friends with, and as possibly harsh as it was to say, he seemed more approachable than the other 4. "Excellent," Ida beamed, then followed her gaze towards their friends, and his smile softened into something more understanding. "They've certainly bonded, haven't they? I suspect it would be wise to avoid trying to go after them, and instead focus on more attainable targets." Agreed. While others might see the high number they carried and think to target them, Momo wasn't an idiot. They were only one team, and 4 teams would make it into the next event. They would simply have to make sure they were one of those 4. As for our other members, Momo scanned the crowd for Kirishima and Ujiro. They were also a part of the group that sparred on weekends, and Momo could tentatively count them as friends as well. Kirishima was already with Bakugou, however, and Ujiro seemed to be joining a multi-class group with Aoyama, someone from Class B, and the purple-haired general studies student. "Excuse me," she turned to find Tokoyami approaching her, followed by the pink-haired support course girl. "Would you be amenable to me joining your group? Dark Shadow has strong defensive and offensive abilities. I believe that combining this with your mobility and adaptability would make a formidable team indeed." "Me too," support girl chimed in. "I've got additional mobility to spare that can help you out. And Yayurazu, right? I've been wanting to talk to you for a while now. I think that with your quirk and my inventions, we could create some amazing babies." Momo blanched. "Amazing?" "She means her inventions," Tokoyami clarified. Momo sighed in relief. "I don't see the problem with that." Belatedly realizing she might have sounded like she was making an executive decision for the both of them, she turned to Ida. "What about you?" Ida waved his hands around excitedly. "I think it's an excellent idea, Tokoyami. I've seen Dark Shadow in action during class, and it truly is a force to be reckoned with. I'd be delighted to have you working alongside us. And you as well." "Hatsune Mei, nice to meet you," Hatsune grinned. "Oh, this is gonna be awesome. Let me show you what I've got for us." Glaring at them isn't going to help, you know. "Shut up," Katsuki growled. Shitty hair was one of the few people he could stand, and he was definitely going to be useful on his team, as someone who could take Katsuki's explosions. Flat face gave them mobility, as well as the ability to make sure Katsuki wouldn't touch the ground if he needed to fly off and steal some headbands, and Sparky added a bit of extra attacking power. None of it fucking mattered though, because Deku and his 3 bastard friends had of course teamed up immediately, and Katsuki wasn't a effing idiot. He knew how badly he'd been beaten in the obstacle race. The one time he'd caught up, Isahat had blasted him back with fucking wind, which shouldn't even be fucking possible, except literally nothing about those 4 should be possible, and Katsuki was soundly crushed. Which, fine. He could deal with that for now. He wasn't obsessed, no matter what that half-and-half bastard said. What mattered in this stupid round was making sure that he made it into the tournament, and making sure his teammates didn't look like fucking idiots, or make him look like an idiot, while they did it. Once they were in the tournament, then he'd crush them. He just had to make it through this event. It was regrouping, that was all. Katsuki hadn't given up. Not by a long shot. After 15 minutes to form teams and talk strategy, 12 cavalry teams are lined up on the field. There are some interesting teams out there. Now, raise those battle cries. It's time for UA's bloody battle. Stan rubbed his hands together. Now this is gonna be good. Let's see them kick some more ass. Fayumi tapped her chin. Their best strategy here is probably staying on the defensive. Actually, as long as they can keep their headband, they win. Wendy nodded. As cool as it would be, going after other teams wastes energy and gives those teams a potential opening to take their headband. They should definitely play defensive. Stan pouted. But that's not nearly as much fun. Don't worry, Mr. Pines, we can watch the other teams go at each other and probably try to go after the crew and fail. That could be funny. That could be funny, Stan begrudged. You're right on this one, Suze. Fayumi gave Stan the side eye. You know, I'm starting to see where my brother and his friends picked up all those strange quirks from. In the metaphorical sense, right? Wendy clarified, amused. Oh, you know what I meant. Shush, they're starting, Present Mike counted them off, and immediately most teams started rushing for their kids. Fayumi sucked in a breath, clutching her hands tightly together. Immediately, Shouto let out a wave of ice, creating a massive wall between them and the rest of the teams, forcing the other teams to stop before they crashed into it. Fayumi let out a sigh of relief. As competent as she knew her little brother was, there would always be a part of her that worried. Oh, look at that, Wendy nudged her. 2 of the teams are working on taking the armbands of others while everyone else is distracted. That's smart of them. Holy shit, it's Cannon Girl. She just pulled a massive mallet out of her stomach. Sure enough, she had, riding on top of her team and using it to break an air shield that one of the other teams was throwing up. Oh, I know who she is, Fayumi realized. That's Yaoyorozu. Shouto's talked about her. And Ida too, the boy with the engine legs. They're both friends. Suze leaned in closer. Oh yeah, they mentioned Ida to us as well. Well, aside from the obvious, I guess I'm rooting for them too. You go get those headbands. There was a massive explosion. The explosion boy, bakugou, had blasted open Shouto's ice wall. Instead of jumping in to attack them, however, he and his team seemed content to let the other teams go after Fayumi's brother and her friends again, taking advantage of the chaos to go after others' headbands. A smart move, even if Fayumi didn't like it. Of course, in response to this, Ochako lifted everyone up into the air, away from all of their pursuers. After a while of different teams trying to reach them and failing, Fayumi watched as more and more groups seemed to give up and start going after each other's headbands. I wonder how long Ochako can actually keep them up there, Stan mused. Hey, Ochako, how long can you keep us up here, exactly? Ochako pondered this. Well, it's way below my weight limit, so I'd say maybe 45 minutes, an hour at most. The match only lasts for 15, Shouto pointed out. That's more than enough time. Mina hummed, considering. Should we just stay up here, then? I mean, that's kind of anticlimactic. Is it even allowed? Izuku wondered. Mina cupped her hands together before shouting down towards Midnight. Hey, Midnight, are we allowed to stay up here the whole match? Midnight shrugged. Most of it, sure. You'll have to be on the ground when the clock strikes 0 though. Thank you, she looked back up at the others. I guess we just hang out up here then, see if anyone else wants to take a crack at us. Izuku grinned sheepishly. We're totally gaming the rules, aren't we? Ochako laughed. We're the mystery crew, gaming the rules is what we do. Want to play a game of I Spy? Looks like Blondie just pissed off the wrong guy, Stan commented, as they watched that Katsuki kid deck it out with another blonde-haired boys group. I mean, those attacks did seem kind of targeted, so I guess it makes sense. Yeah, no kidding. Oh wow, they're really going to town now. Wendy munched on her popcorn. Wait, can Blondie copy quirks? That's pretty cool. But does he know how to use them well? Fayumi wondered. Oh, I think he just copied the electricity boy's quirk. Oh no. Stan cackled as Blondie tried to use the electricity quirk and fried himself, allowing Bakugou's team to steal back their headband, along with multiple other headbands that Blondie had collected. I may not like that brat, but he's got spunk, and seriously, electricity? Blondie should have known better. If he can copy quirks, I wonder if that means that electricity boy fries himself as well? Fuyumi mused. I hope not, that would be horrible. If he is, I bet the teachers are working with him on it, Suze offered. Wow, our dudes are really just chilling up there, huh? As the clock counted down, with 10 seconds left in the game, Ochako touched them down gently on the ground, and Shadow threw up another ice wall, so that no one would try and take their headband at the last second. And, time's up, Present Mike announced. Now, let's take a look at the top 4 teams right away. In first place, Team Uraraka, who kept their cool million for the entire match. Izuku looked up at the board, and sure enough, there they were, right on top. Wait, why is it my team all of a sudden? Ochako wondered. 'Cause you were the rider, Mina pointed out. That means you stood out. In second place, Team Bakugou. In third place, Team Yayurazu. Ochako beamed and waved their friends over. Congratulations, you guys did great. Yayurazu smiled. Thank you. You also did extremely well. Ida, that special move was so cool, Mina gushed. I didn't know you could do that. Ida puffed out his chest slightly. Well, we've all been working hard, haven't we? I was saving it for the right moment. Fair, fair. Mina nodded mock seriously, then turned to the support course girl. You're the one who made all of those cool support course items like the hover boots and grappling hooks and such, right? I have so many questions about those. Support course girl beamed. That's me, Hatsume, at your service, and I'm always ready to talk about my babies. In fourth place, Team Tets. Wait, no, it's Team Shinso. When did that happen? Izuku looked over and spotted the purple-haired Gen Ed student, Shinso, apparently, looking smug. Behind him, Aoyama was cringing, the 1B boy was staring off into space, and Ojiro looked immensely confused. Well, I'm glad that Ojiro got in, Izuku said. He doesn't seem very happy about it, though. What happened there? Could it have been Shinso's quirk? These 4 teams will advance to the final round. Now we'll take an hour's break for lunch before we start with the afternoon festivities. Stan groaned as he got up. It's about time. The kids have said that the food here is restaurant quality. Why don't we put that to the test? We might not be able to, Fuyumi pointed out. I mean, Father might have a pass for the lunch rush food, but even if we've commandeered his skybox, he's still going to use that. Nah, don't worry about it. Stan flashed 4 passes in front of her. We've got our own way to get that food. Fuyumi blinked. Where did you get those? Don't ask questions you don't want the answers to. Now it's lunchtime. Shadow, Izuku looked at his friend curiously. What's wrong? Shadow, who had been staring at the student and faculty entrance, shook his head. It's nothing. Weirdness knowledge, I guess. I thought I'd already filled up my quota of that for today. I'm not sure why I'm getting it again. Oh. Izuku could see why that would be unnerving. Do you want to talk about it? I guess. It's not bad, just strange. He shook his head. A weird image of us talking right there. Me telling you about my home life, I think for the first time. Which obviously makes no sense, since you already know about it. That was weird. Izuku frowned, considering this. Maybe it's a sort of what could have been scenario. Like if we hadn't ended up in Gravity Falls. Although in that case, I don't know if we'd have become friends like we are now. And that doesn't explain why you'd tell me that sort of thing here and now. Shadow seemed to contemplate this. I think maybe by this point I'd have figured out that you had some connection to All Might. And considering how obsessed my old man is with beating him, maybe I wanted to warn you in case Endeavor made that connection as well. He sighed. It doesn't really matter though, does it? That's not what happened here. Yeah? Izuku looked at the entrance for another moment, before nudging Shadow slightly, and smiling when he turned to him. Whatever the case, I'm glad we're in this timeline. I'm so glad we're friends. Shadow's gaze softened. Yeah? Me too. You look down, Kirishima noted, as everyone gathered together for lunch. What's wrong? You got in. Ojiro frowned. Yes, but I don't remember how. It doesn't feel right. I think the general studies student, Shinso. He asked me something. I answered back. And then suddenly I was jolted and the match was almost over. I don't remember anything in between those two events. How strange, Ida considered this. Perhaps it's his quirk. A brainwashing quirk, possibly. And it sounds like one that activates through responding to him, Momo agreed. We'll need to be careful if we end up facing him during the tournament. Ochako looked at Ojiro, who still seemed down. Hey, don't worry about it. Maybe you'll get a rematch with him this afternoon, and you show him that he never should have done that. Ojiro made a small noise of agreement, but still looked conflicted. I guess, but I don't think I will. Everyone's worked so hard to get here, and I can't even remember how I did it. Fighting in the tournament just doesn't seem fair. I think I'm going to step down. You shouldn't, Shadow said. Even if you don't remember, you still earned your spot in the tournament. You shouldn't let what Shinso did stop you from proving your own merits this afternoon. Maybe? Ojiro didn't look convinced, and Ochako shared a look with Shadow. Hopefully Ojiro would change his mind and stay in, but it was still his choice, and they couldn't stop him. She still hated that this was happening to her friend, though. She hoped that whoever went up against Shinso kicked his ass. If it was her, she definitely would. What are you doing here? Next to Wendy, Fuyumi flinched. Still, Shadow's sister smiled. Hello, father. I'm here to watch Shadow. He's doing really well so far, isn't he? This was the first time Wendy had seen Shadow and Fuyumi's dad. The flaming mustache and beard looked ridiculous, but the way he glared down at his much shorter daughter changed him from ridiculous to intimidating. It also made Wendy's blood boil. You would say that, knowing as little as you do, Endeavor scoffed. I didn't say you could come. You've been more than enough of a distraction to Shadow lately. You'd do well to remember how different he is from you. If I see you affecting his performance today in any way, there will be consequences. He took a step forward, and Fuyumi flinched again. Wendy glared at him and opened her mouth, but Fuyumi caught her eye and shook her head slightly. Of course, father. HMF. With that, Endeavor walked past them, and Stan and Suze, who were lagging slightly behind, without sparing another glance at his daughter. So that's your old man, huh? Stan mused, glaring in Endeavor's direction. What a bastard. What did he mean by how different you and Shadow are? Suze wondered. Fuyumi winced. It's, father wanted a child with both his fire and mom's ice. Shadow was the only one who got both, so the rest of us were considered failures. Not that Shadow's had it any easier for being the success, of course. Usually it isn't too bad for me. He mostly ignores me. He's a dick, Wendy stressed. You and Shadow both deserve better than that. Fuyumi blinked, as if she couldn't believe that someone would include her in the deserving better category, before smiling sadly. Thank you. In the meantime, Stan smirked and held up a wallet that definitely wasn't his. I'm going to hide this somewhere funny. See how long it takes for your old man to realize it's missing and find it. Fuyumi made a noise that somehow conveyed shock, dismay, and amusement, and Wendy laughed out loud. Us cheerleading? With those girls brought in specifically to cheer, who have an entire routine that they've practiced for ages and we don't know, Mina rolled her eyes. Very funny. The sports festival has never done that before, and they're definitely not doing it this year. No, it's true, Minta insisted. You guys need to change quickly, or you'll all look bad when all the other girls show up in their outfits. The fact that it's you insisting on this makes it clear that it's fake, Ochako said dryly. Now go away and let us finish our break. Kaminari, who was standing next to Minta, shrugged, amused but unbothered. I did tell you they wouldn't fall for it. Oh, come on, Minta whined. You'd all look so sexy in them, and I bet it would get you even more sponsors. You know the kind of assets people really want to see on female heroes. There was a pause as all the girls stared at him, unimpressed. Then Yaoyorozu turned to Ochako. Did you bring the flashlight and the jar? No, not the jar again. Sure did. Ochako held Minta in place with her power before he could run away, before getting the flashlight that Izuku had packed, as well as the jar. Looks like Deku was right to bring it. She shone the flashlight on Minta and plopped him in the jar again. Jiru glared at Kaminari. Don't think you're off the hook either. Did you seriously think it was a good idea to go along with him? I just thought it would be funny, Kaminari trailed off as he finally read the room. Then he grinned awkwardly and put his hands up in surrender. Yeah, that was uncool, sorry. My bad. Won't do it again. Please don't put me in the jar. Kaminari, you sellout, Minta squeaked. This sucks, I'm too small already, without being shrunk even further. If I have to be this small, you could at least let me nest in Yayurazu's boobs. Uraraka? Shake the jar, please. On it. Minta yelped as Ochako gently shook the jar, not nearly hard enough to give Minta any actual injuries, but just enough to rattle him a bit. Tsuyu raised an eyebrow. Hey, Minta, why do you even want to become a hero? I don't think you've done a single heroic thing since we started school, aside from helping me round up those water villains. And that was only when your own life was on the line. Isn't it obvious? Heroes are cool and famous and get all the hot girls. Except we all hate you, Mina pointed out. Literally no one in this class thinks you're cool, and all of the girls despise you. If you keep acting this way, what makes you think things will change once we graduate? You think hero agencies will want to hire someone who doesn't actually care about saving people and only ever harasses their female employees? You'll be blacklisted within a year. For once, Minta seemed stunned enough that he had nothing to say. Think about that for the rest of the break, Ochako said quietly. We'll let you out before the tournament starts. Now that lunch is over, it's finally time to reveal the last game. But before that, there's good news for all of you who didn't make it to the finals. This is just a sports festival, so we've prepared recreational games that everyone can participate in too. Before midnight could draw out the team, however, Ojiro stepped forwards to withdraw. Mina winced because she had hoped that he would change his mind, but it seemed like he was pretty set on it. At the very least, drawing attention like this would still make some pros look at him, right? Shortly after that, the boy from Class B on Ojiro's team withdrew as well, while Aoyama decided to stay in the tournament. Shiozaki and Tetsutetsu were moved up and into the tournament, and finally, lots were drawn. Above them, on the screens, the tournament bracket finally popped up. Mina searched for her name and found that Aoyama was her first opponent. Considering how she dodged things much faster than his laser before, she wasn't concerned. After that though, it was either Yaeurazu or Takoyami, and that would be a much trickier fight. Shinso first, Izuku muttered. Alright then, I can do that. But after that, oh, looks like Shouto and I will be going up against each other in the quarterfinals. I was hoping it would be semi-finals, at least, Shouto agreed. I'm sure we can make it work. Put on a good show for the audience so that whoever loses will still get lots of interest from the pros. Sounds good to me. Bakugou first, huh? Ochako mused. Then she grinned. Oh, that's going to be fun. It's you, isn't it? Midoriya Izuku, looking forward to the first match. Izuku jumped slightly before turning around. Shinso, the jerk with the brainwashing quirk, was right behind him. Mina remembered what Ojiro had said about responding to him being some kind of trigger, and clearly Izuku remembered too, because he just silently nodded his head. Nothing about Izuku seemed to change, and Shinso simply smirked before leaving. Mina nudged him. How do you feel? Normal, Izuku admitted. I think his quirk really is triggered by verbal responses. I know I mutter a lot, and I respond to people on instinct, so maybe this isn't the best match. I'll have to be careful. You can do it, Ochako encouraged. All right, let's leave the tournament aside for a momentary interlude. Let's have fun with the recreation. Mina grinned. The first two events had showcased their quirks, powers, and abilities pretty well, but she hadn't been in a position to use her strength yet, or show her full range of mobility and combat skills. With the tournament, she'd finally get to put those things to use. This was going to be so much fun. Midoriya is up first, right? Against Shinso? Momo shifted slightly in her seat. I'm sure he'll do well, but I am a bit worried about the verbal trigger part, especially considering Midoriya's muttering habit. Me too, Ashido admitted. But I'm sure he'll find a way around it. What about you? Are you excited for your match? I suppose. Momo winced. Truth be told, having seen Tokoyami in action as part of her team during the Cavalry battle, she wasn't sure she could beat him. Dark Shadow was extremely strong, and she wasn't sure how she'd begin to counter that. What about light? Momo looked up to see Todoroki looking at her. It's called dark shadow. Want to bet that it's weak to light? That was certainly a possibility. And Takoyami had been training by trying to remain in floodlights for longer periods of time. I can see that. Perhaps some flash bombs, then. It was only the beginning of a strategy, but it was better than nothing, and Momo was sure she could figure out more from there. Thank you for the suggestion, Todoroki. No problem. Ida leaned forwards. Quiet down, everyone. Midoriya's match is starting. Hey guys, are you ready? Izuku listened to present Mike's announcement, trying to calm his nerves. He could do this. He'd done much scarier things before, and he had full cowling, so he didn't need to worry about breaking his bones. Shinso hadn't done much physically during both previous events, so there was a good chance he also wasn't a physical fighter, which meant that if Izuku could just keep quiet, then he'd win easily. Hey, Izuku jumped slightly, before turning around to find All Might walking up to him. Thankfully, he no longer flinched when dealing with a real All Might. Sure, a lot of his issues that stemmed from the bubble were still there, but at least he could talk to his mentor normally now. I just wanted to catch up before your match, All Might said, smiling. You've done brilliantly so far. I wanted to make sure you know that I have full faith in you, young Midoriya. Izuku smiled back. Thanks, All Might. I'll make you proud. My boy, you already do. Time and time again. Izuku beamed, and tried not to cry. He didn't want Shinso to see him full of tears right before their match. Present Might called for them to enter the stadium, and Izuku offered All Might one last grin. All right, I'm off. Good luck, my boy. And with those words of encouragement, Izuku headed into the arena, head held high. Audience, the finals that you've all been waiting for are finally starting. Match number 1. He took first place in the obstacle course, and was on the winning team in the cavalry battle. You might look plain, but you're rocking it, kid. Everyone give it up for hero course student Midoriya Izuku. The crowd erupted into cheers. Izuku took them all in, and even though he'd been at the center of a few crowds before, including the one in Globnar, this was different. These were pro-heroes cheering for him, like he was someone impressive, like he was someone worth looking at. His eyes caught on the box where his class was, and all of his friends shouting down encouragement at him. He looked up to them and gave them as confident of a grin as he could manage. Sorry, he hasn't done anything to stand out yet. From General Studies, it's Shinso Hitoshi. The rules are simple, Present Mike explained. Force your opponent out of bounds, or immobilize them. You can also win by making your opponent say, I give up. Put your morals and ethics aside for the moment. But of course, anything life-threatening is not allowed. I give up, huh? Shinso mused. This is a fight to test the strength of your spirit. If you know what you want for your future, then you can't worry about appearances. Shinso clearly didn't, given everything that he'd done so far. Of course, Izuku didn't either. He'd done much shadier things than Shinso had, both for a good cause and also because that was how things worked back in Gravity Falls. He couldn't blame Shinso for that. Acknowledging that didn't mean he had to like the guy, though. Not after what he did to Ejiro. Izuku charged up full cowling. That monkey was going on and on about his pride, Shinso continued, and Izuku did a double take, because monkey? Was Shinso quirkist? But don't you think he was dumb for throwing away his chance? Not that you specifically would know, I guess. Everything's been about luck for you, hasn't it? You and those 2 girls and Endeavor's son. Him especially, of course. He really hasn't accomplished anything that wasn't handed to him on a silver platter, was he? Izuku started forward, furious. You don't. Shit. What the hell is he doing? It must be Shinso's quirk, Fuyumi reasoned. Come on, Izuku, you've got this. Deku, no. And after I warned him too, Ojiro groaned. As Izuku started walking towards the boundary, Kirishima turned to Shoto. You'd better beat Shinso next round, Todoroki. Shoto kept looking down at the arena, frowning intently. Don't count him out just yet. Shinso Hitoshi, from General Studies, has gotten the better of Midoriya Izuku from the hero course. Who could have imagined this? Will the bottom really overthrow the top? This is why I said the entrance exam wasn't rational, Aizawa sighed, from his place next to Mike in the commenting box. Shinso failed the practical exam for the hero course. Since he also applied for general studies, he probably knew that would happen. His quirk is very powerful, but the practical exam consisted of fighting robots. That gave an advantage to those with physical attack quirks. That's not wrong, Mina admitted. Still doesn't excuse the way he's talked about us, though, and I still want Izuku to beat him. Ojiro sighed. Yeah. Honestly, if he'd actually asked me if I wanted to join his team, instead of brainwashing me into it, I wouldn't have a problem with him. It's his attitude, not his quirk, that I don't like. He leaned forward. Come on, Midoriya. You've got this. Turn around and walk out of bounds. It was like there was a fuzz in Izuku's brain, trying to smother his thoughts and controlling his actions. Distantly, he could see himself slowly walking towards the other side of the arena, his body moving on its own. Everything felt so fuzzy, like a fog covering his brain. Fog covering his brain. Like a more overt version of what he'd experienced in the bubble. No. He'd overcome Cypher's bubble, hadn't he? With the help of his friends, he'd realized something was wrong. Something was definitely wrong now, and the walls weren't even turning to blood here. He could do this. He'd done it before. He just needed to snap himself out of it. Izuku flicked his fingers. There was a massive explosion. Izuku winced as his fingers broke from the full use of One for All, before the regeneration kicked in and they healed immediately. He hated using that again, but he was pretty sure full cowling wouldn't have been enough in this particular instance. But this had worked. He'd broken free again, even if he could now hear how fast his heart was beating, panic rising in his chest from the sudden and unexpected reminder of the bubble. If he blinked, it was almost like he was back there, with the Aizawa made of maggots and everyone trying to kill them. No, he wasn't there. He was actually home. He was at the sports festival. Was he, though? Izuku shook his head desperately. He needed to finish this, and quickly. He could freak out over it later. He turned back to Shinso and summoned full cowling. Running forwards as fast as he could, the rushing of blood in his ears blocking out Shinso's attempts to get him to talk again. They made contact, and Izuku shoved hard. Shinso attempted to fight back, but Izuku was far too experienced for him to come close. Seconds later, Shinso was out of bounds. Distantly, Izuku heard Midnight calling the match, and he had to remind himself not to flinch. She's real. All of this is real. I'm not back there. I'm not. It didn't feel real, though. But Shinso was staring into space too, looking devastated, and Izuku suddenly found himself talking. If you want to work on getting into the hero course, talk to Hagakure. Shinso frowned. Excuse me? Hagakure, Izuku repeated, has an invisibility quirk, not an offensive quirk, and she still figured out how to beat the entrance exam. Instead of trying to antagonize us like this, maybe talk to someone in your position who figured out how to beat the entrance exam anyways. He paused. And another thing for the record, I really hope you just called Ojiro a monkey in order to rile me up, and not because you actually believe it. It doesn't matter what your quirk is if you can't act like a hero. Class A already dealt with that enough when it came to Kaken and Mainta. They didn't need another. When had he started thinking of Kaken as anything less than excellent hero material? Everything seemed to go through the motions after that. The crowd cheered for both him and Shinso, and Izuku made his way out of the arena as fast as he could, heading for the waiting room. If he ran fast enough, he could pretend that there were no eyes watching him, that the walls weren't going to start bleeding and everyone wouldn't start trying to kill them, that he wasn't going to have to kill All Might again. The other three were in the waiting room. Something must have shown on his face because they all jumped to their feet, looking worried. Deku? It was fog, Izuku managed. Fog in my brain, like there was in the bubble. Is in the bubble? Shouto, you're fire. Shouto's eyes lit up with understanding. I've got you. His hands then lit up with flames, and no illusion shattered around them. Izuku took a deep breath before letting it out. Thanks. I messed up. He kept insulting you guys and Ojiro and I got upset. And then the brainwashing activated and the fog felt like... It's okay, Ochako promised, guiding him over to them and holding him tightly. You're okay, Izuku. We promise. And you did great, Mina encouraged him. At least, from our perspective. And now Shinso is out, and we won't have to worry about him again. Izuku winced. It's not his fault. He didn't ask to be born with a quirk that would trigger my worst memories, I guess, and I shouldn't have responded in the first place. He turned to Shadow. And I'm taking up time that you need to prepare for your match too. I'm so sorry. Shadow very nearly rolled his eyes. Izuku, Sero is a classmate with a good quirk and great enthusiasm. But I'm not going to lose to him, even with little prep time. Don't worry about it. Izuku let out a watery laugh at that. Yeah, I guess that makes sense. I didn't mean to doubt your abilities or anything. You just didn't want to hurt a friend? Like how you responded to Shinso because he was saying terrible things about us. It's fine, Izuku. There's no shame in caring. Shadow shrugged. Honestly, I wish I was as good at expressing that kind of stuff as you are. Even though I'm a bit of a crybaby, and it almost made me lose the match. Even then, Mina insisted. Especially then, we love you just the way you are. Like Shadow says, we're lucky to have a friend who loves as much as you do. Ochako nodded, and Izuku finally felt the tension start to leave him. He leaned on his girlfriend's shoulder and breathed. Something was wrong. Shadow had felt strange ever since they'd entered the area designated for the sports festival this morning. Still, it had been a strangeness he could ignore. After using his flame, however, suddenly it was much stronger, more in his face. Everything felt unbalanced, like he was walking on the precipice of something shattering. He didn't know what, but it unnerved him, and it was making it hard to concentrate on anything. He'd told the others not to worry about his fight with Sero, and he still believed that. But with how distraught Izuku was, he hadn't wanted to mention his own sudden uneasiness. Izuku didn't need to deal with the added stress at the moment, he'd tell them later. You're acting disgracefully, Shadow. And there was his father, standing in the way of where he needed to be. Shadow had to walk past him if he wanted to get to his match with Sero. You let that VERYYYY boy beat you in the obstacle race, Endeavor continued, and you barely contributed at all in the cavalry battle. While creating wind was very impressive, and something we will continue to hone, you have not used your fire, even when it would be to your advantage. Don't tell me you've changed your mind and are planning to continue your little rebellion. I can assure you I won't stand for that. And Shadow nearly laughed at that. I didn't use my fire because it wasn't necessary, he said, deliberately stretching out the words, as if trying to explain a basic concept to a 5-year-old. And how many times do I have to tell you that you're not even part of the picture? Sorry to say, but living vicariously through me isn't going to work. For you to succeed, I'd have to actually care about helping you. Endeavor looked taken aback, before starting towards him furiously. How dare? What are you going to do? Shadow challenged, smiling. Hit me? Right before I go on camera in front of millions? Don't tell me you're that stupid. His father stopped, mouth hanging open like a fish. It really was funny how dumb he was. Shadow turned and kept walking past him. Shadow, get back here. Don't you dare turn your back on me, Shadow. Shadow was all too happy to ignore him. In fact, despite dealing with his father just now, he felt better than he had in a long time. Thanks for waiting. Next up is these guys, Present Mike announced, as Shadow stepped onto the stage, looking across it towards his opponent. There really wasn't much to be concerned about like he'd told Sparks. Sero was going to be easy. In fact, Sero would be boring. But at the very least, he could make it fun, couldn't he? He's good, but what's with that plainness he just can't get rid of? From the hero course, it's Sero Hanta versus taking second in the obstacle course, and then winning a team victory in the cavalry battle. You're way too strong, kid. He wasn't recommended for admission for nothing. Also from the hero course, it's Todoroki Shadow. Shadow smiled, because Present Mike really had no idea. Todoroki, what's with that look on your face? Are you actually smiling? Is something wrong with that? Shadow wondered lightly. Sero chuckled nervously. No, it's just kind of weird. Ready, start. Sero shot out his tape, which wrapped around Shadow, and swung him towards the bounds of the arena. A good idea, if it had been someone else. Shadow laughed. Then he shot his ice out. Seconds later, most of Sero was frozen in ice. And so was a good half of the entire stadium, stretching out high above the roof. Holy shit, kid. Hey, Fuyumi? Is that normal? Fuyumi stared down at her brother, feeling slightly sick. For how he's been since he came home from your world? Absolutely not. Something was wrong. There was a long, shocked silence. Shouto stared at his frozen classmate and realized just what he'd done, how overboard he'd gone, what he'd been thinking like. Shouto nearly retched. "Sero, can you move?" Midnight asked, shivering, half of her body covered in ice, and Shouto had done that. "Of course not. Don't you think this is a bit much?" Sero asked, shivering. Even as his left side warmed him up, Shouto shivered too, for very different reasons. "Yeah, that was more than overkill. I'm sorry. I can just give me a second. I'll unfreeze you." "Sero is immobilized," Midnight announced. "Todoroki moves on to the next round." No one in the crowd cheered. Instead, they started shouting encouragement to Sero, and as he unfroze his classmate, Shouto found he couldn't blame them at all. Even when he'd dealt with having Cypher's thoughts before, he'd never acted on them like this. And with the multiple instances of weirdness knowledge he'd gotten earlier, and how disconnected and unbalanced everything felt. Shouto disconnected. He vaguely remembered thawing out the ice he'd created and leaving the arena, but it was all a blur. When he came to, he was in some random hall within the stadium proper. Mocking his father like that was weird, but he could deal with it if Cypher's influence was just that. But he'd gone overboard, not because he was angry, but because he was bored and thought it would be fun. He could have seriously hurt his classmate. He'd thought of Izuku as sparks. Shouto stumbled to the nearest trash bin and threw up in it. Then he slid down against the wall and curled up, his knees drawn close to his chest. He wasn't sure how long it was that he stayed there, curled up in that position as he was, before footsteps echoed through the hallway, and Mina sat down next to him. "Hey," she said gently. "Thought I'd find you here." Shouto blinked. "Really? I didn't know I was going to be here." "Yup. I may not be nearly as smart as you or Izuku, or even Ochako, but I know you well enough by now to find you, even when you don't know." Shouto frowned slightly. "Don't sell yourself short like that." "I'm not," Mina insisted. "I just know my strengths and weaknesses is all." The two of them sat there for a long moment, and Shouto was hesitant to break the comfortable silence. Finally, Mina sighed. "It's getting worse, isn't it?" Shouto flinched. It was that obvious. She shrugged. "Sort of. Everyone knew something was wrong, especially Izuku and Ochako. We've all seen you smile, and that wasn't your smile. But I'm the only one who really interacted with Cypher when he stole your body. I saw how he smiled when he looked like you. You looked just like he did when we were on that cliff." If Shouto's stomach wasn't already empty, he would have thrown up again. "It's been so much worse today," he admitted. "And this is the third time I've gotten something from Cypher since we arrived, at least, and everything feels wrong. Something about this place, I think it's making things worse." Mina considered this. "Do you want to leave?" she suggested softly. "We could ditch right now." Shouto stared at her. "The sports festival isn't really that important." She shrugged. "Not as important as this. If being here is hurting you, then maybe we should go." For a long moment, Shouto seriously thought about it. Eventually, though, he sighed. "I don't think that's going to help. Whatever is aggravating this, I don't think leaving will make things go back to how they were yesterday. Not at this point. Besides, Ford's almost done with the charm. I just have to make it through this afternoon." "If you're sure." Mina took his hand and squeezed it tightly. "Then all right, let's make it until the festival is over, or until Ford comes with the charm. One of the four of us will win, and then we can bring home medals and fix all this Cypher stuff on top of it. It'll work out." "Yeah," Shouto agreed softly. "I was a real ass to you, wasn't I? Back when we first met. To the point that it was frankly hard to look back on some of those early adventures in Gravity Falls without wincing." If he told the Shouto from back then just how much of an anchor Mina would become to him, he never would have believed himself. He probably would have brushed off the idea that Mina could be anyone's anchor. Mina laughed. "Nah, it was mutually antagonistic. I was messing with you on purpose because I thought you were too uptight, so at least half the blame is on me. I mean, I was too uptight." "Yeah, but knowing what I know now, you had good reasons for it." She gave him an encouraging grin. Let's just call it even and not worry about it. If you're sure. They sat like that for a while longer, and slowly, Shoto could feel the terror that had been running through his body fade away. Things still weren't great. Everything about this stadium still felt off. But it was back to a manageable level, at least. Eventually, Mina nudged him. Ready to head back up? Yeah, I think so. Together, they made their way to their 1A's booth. So alright folks, that's all for today. Stay tuned for part 10. Do subscribe, like and share for more such videos. Also check out the story and author jkawsome on FANFICTIONnet. Press the bell icon to be notified first on release. See you in the next video. Till then, goodbye.